Silas Vane didn't knock. He never did. Pushed open the door to the territorial land office in Helena, like he owned the building, which in every way that mattered he did. 3 clerks scrambled to their feet. The 4th, young enough to still believe in things, stayed seated half a second too long. Vane walked past him, reached down without breaking stride, and swept the boy's entire desk onto the floor. Ledgers, inkwells, 7 months of recorded deeds. File these again, Vane said, dropping a stack of altered documents onto the empty desktop. By Friday, all of them. Nobody asked what had been changed. Nobody ever did. Somewhere in that stack was the future of Nathan Cole's ranch and the lives of 11 families who had no idea their land was already gone. If you've ever watched someone take everything from a person who deserved better and felt completely powerless to stop it, then this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let me tell you how it really began. The morning Evelyn Bennett walked onto the Cole ranch, she was carrying a canvas bag that had seen better decades, wearing boots that didn't match the mud, and sweating through a cotton dress that had been washed so many times the blue had nearly gone gray. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and built in a way that strangers noticed first and forgot to look past. She had thick arms, wide hips, a face that was plain rather than pretty, and a posture that said she had spent years deciding not to be ashamed of any of it. She had walked the last 3 miles from Ridgeline because the hired wagon driver had said something she chose not to repeat, and she had gotten off and walked rather than sit beside a man like that for another hour. Her feet hurt. She was hungry. She had $11.40 to her name. She stopped at the fence line, looked up at the house, and took stock. It was a big house. A house built for impressing people, not for living in. The porch boards were solid but unwashed. The garden plot beside the south wall had gone to weeds so thick you could lose a calf in them. There was a rusted bucket hanging from the well post, which meant someone had stopped caring about the well a long time ago. The kitchen window, visible from where she stood, had a broken shutter swinging loose on one hinge, knocking against the frame every time the wind came through. The ranch itself, the barns, the paddocks, the pasture land spreading west toward the foothills, was in excellent shape. Well-fenced, well-stocked, well-run. She could see that from here. So whoever ran this place knew everything about keeping cattle alive and nothing about keeping a home alive. Evelyn picked up her bag and walked toward the front door. She knocked twice and waited. What she expected was a ranch foreman or maybe a housekeeper or maybe nobody at all. What she got was the door swinging open and Nathan Cole filling the entire frame. She had heard he was large. People in Ridgeline had said large, the way you'd warn someone about a weather change casually, like a fact of nature. But Nathan Cole wasn't large in any ordinary way. He was 6 feet 5 inches and built like someone had decided to make a man out of the side of a mountain. His shoulders were wider than the doorframe was comfortable with. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were the size of dinner plates. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, and eyes the color of creek water in October gray-green and very still. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "I'm here about the cook and housekeeper position," Evelyn said. "I saw the notice in Ridgeline." Nathan stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "That notice went up 3 weeks ago. I know, I was working elsewhere. I finished that job and came here." He glanced past her toward the road. "Did you come alone?" "I walked from the crossroads." Something shifted in his face. Not admiration exactly, more like recalculation. He stepped back and let her in. The inside of the house confirmed everything she had suspected from the outside. The front room had good furniture, solid, expensive, covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested nobody used it. The fireplace had ash that hadn't been cleaned in at least 2 weeks. There were boots by the door and a coat thrown over a chair, and 3 different coffee cups on the mantel, none of them anywhere near the kitchen. The kitchen was worse. It wasn't dirty exactly, it was abandoned. The stove was functional but cold. The pantry had staples: flour, salt, dried beans, but they'd been shoved onto shelves without any order. The kind of kitchen that a man used to make coffee and heat canned goods and thought that was enough. Evelyn set her bag on the table without asking permission. "What happened to your last housekeeper?" she asked. "She left in March." Nathan was standing in the doorway, watching her look around his kitchen with an expression she couldn't fully read. Said the house was too isolated. Was it? The house is exactly where it's always been. Evelyn opened the pantry, made a quick inventory with her eyes, and closed it again. "You've got weevils in the cornmeal," she said. "That whole bag needs to go." And someone put the salt next to the damp wall, which means it's been pulling moisture for weeks. "Do you have chickens?" 8. "Are they laying?" "Some." "Then whoever's been collecting eggs hasn't been doing it daily, because you're getting less than you should." She turned and looked at him directly. I can fix all of this. I'm a good cook, a thorough housekeeper, and I know how to run a household budget without wasting your money. I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not going to ask you to feel sorry for me. I want honest work and fair pay. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. He was studying her the way you study a horse you're not sure about, not unkindly but carefully. You're direct, he said. It saves time. The pay is $12 a month plus room and board. 14. And I'll get that garden back into production before the first frost. Another pause. Longer this time. 13, Nathan said. 13 and a half, he almost smiled. It was hard to tell with his face. Fine, he said. That was how Evelyn Bennett came to the coal ranch. No fanfare, no introduction, no moment of destiny. She haggled a man twice her size up 50 cents and went to work. The thing about living inside your own life is that you stop seeing it. Nathan Cole had been on this ranch for 11 years. He had arrived at 18 with almost nothing, a borrowed horse, a small inheritance from an uncle who died early, and an absolutely unreasonable certainty that he was going to build something. He had built it. That was not a small thing. He had worked alongside his hands, not above them, and they respected him for it. He had turned 300 acres into 1,500. He had built pens, barns, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a proper well. He had survived a bad winter in 1876 that killed half the cattle in the territory and come out the other side with his herd intact by sheer stubbornness. What he had not done was live in the house he built. He ate at the bunkhouse with the men most evenings. He slept in the house because it was there, but he didn't spend time in it. Rooms that had been furnished with a vague idea of someday had stayed that way, with the someday always pushed forward. There had been a woman once, a few years back, a widow from the next county over who had made 3 trips out to the ranch and then stopped making them without ever explaining why. Nathan had told himself he was relieved. Now there was an arranged engagement, which had seemed like a practical solution to a practical problem when his lawyer, Thayer, had first raised the idea 6 months ago. A rancher of his standing needed stability, heirs, someone to manage the household. Margaret Whitlock was a well-bred woman from a good Denver family. They had exchanged letters. She seemed capable and sensible. She was arriving in 12 days. Nathan had not yet figured out what to tell her about the state of the house. Evelyn solved that problem by simply solving the house. She started that first afternoon. Not with the big things, the broken shutter, the garden, but with the kitchen, which she seemed to understand was the heart of any home and the most honest signal of how a place was being lived in. She threw out the weevil-riddled cornmeal, rearranged the pantry by logic rather than by habit, scrubbed the stove, and had coffee going within 2 hours of arriving. Real coffee, properly made with the grounds measured right. Nathan came in from the south pasture at dusk expecting nothing, and found the kitchen lit up and warm and smells like something was actually happening in it. There was a pot of beans with salt pork on the stove, a pan of cornbread in the oven, and Evelyn at the table with pencils and a piece of paper, writing something. "What's that?" he asked. "A list of what the pantry needs and what I can substitute until we get it." She didn't look up. "There's coffee on the stove. Cups are on the second shelf now, not the mantel." He poured himself a cup, drank it standing by the stove. It was considerably better than what he'd been making for himself. "The cornbread will be done in 10 minutes, she said. "If you want to eat here or take it to the bunkhouse, either way." "I'll eat here," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It just came out. She looked up from the list. Her expression was neutral, assessing the look of someone trying to figure out if that answer meant something or was just a word. "All right," she said, and went back to writing. That was dinner, not a conversation, not a moment of connection. Just a man eating cornbread and beans at his own kitchen table for the first time in a long while, and a woman making a list of what the pantry needed, and the stove keeping them both warm. It wasn't much. But there was something about the ordinary aliveness of it that Nathan felt in his chest without quite knowing what to do with. He had hands who were curious about her naturally. Pete Dunbar, his foreman, was the first one to say anything. Pete was 53, had worked cattle since he was 14, and had strong opinions about almost everything that he generally kept to himself except when he didn't. "New cook seems capable," Pete said the next morning, handing Nathan a fence report. "She is, big woman. She's a good cook." Pete was quiet for a moment, studying the fence report, as though it suddenly required a great deal of concentration. "Miss Whitlock arrives in 12 days. I know when she arrives. Just observing." "Observe something else," Nathan said. Pete observed something else. The hands ate better starting on Evelyn's 3rd morning. She had assessed the bunkhouse cooking situation and quietly taken it over without making it anyone's problem. Breakfast was hot and consistent. The coffee was strong. A ranch runs partly on what it eats, and these men started running a little smoother, a little more willing to stay late when the work needed it. Evelyn noticed things, too, in the way that people who have lived carefully notice things, small things. The way Nathan moved through the house, always quickly, like he was passing through somewhere rather than living in it. The way the second bedroom upstairs was full of crates and folded canvas that suggested someone had planned to use the room and then stopped planning. The way there were books on the shelf in the front room with no signs anyone had ever read them, the spines uncracked, the whole shelf looking like a decoration someone had thought a home ought to have. She didn't say anything about it. That wasn't her place. She did her work and kept her observations to herself, which was a skill she had needed to develop a long time ago. By the end of her first week, the broken shutter was fixed. She had found tools in the shed and done it herself rather than ask anyone. The garden was cleared of the worst of the weeds, and she had salvaged a late planting of turnips and hardy greens that might actually make it if the frost held off. She had found a rag rug in a trunk upstairs clearly unused and put it by the kitchen door to catch mud. She had scrubbed the front room fireplace and laid a fire there so the room could be used rather than preserved. Nathan came home one evening to find her in the front room, that same pencil in hand, reading one of the unread books. He stopped in the doorway. "Do you mind?" she asked, not sounding like she thought he would. "No," he said, genuinely surprised. "What is it?" She held up the spine. "A History of Missouri, published in 1871. It was the most interesting-looking one," she said, which is not saying a great deal. He sat down in the chair across the fire. He couldn't have said why exactly. Maybe because the room finally felt like a room someone was supposed to sit in. "You read a lot?" he asked. "Whenever I can find books," which isn't always. She turned a page. "My father had a small library. Nebraska homestead. We didn't have much, but he kept books." She said it simply, without nostalgia. Just a fact about where she came from. "What happened to the homestead?" Nathan asked. She was quiet for a beat. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like she was deciding whether to answer fully or briefly. "We lost it," she said, "when I was 17. Bad contract, dishonest land agent. My father didn't understand what he was signing." She turned another page. "He worked that land for 9 years and lost it in an afternoon. We had 30 days to leave." Nathan looked at his fire. He didn't say he was sorry because she hadn't said it to get sympathy. She had said it the way you say a thing that happened to you, something that shaped you without defining you. At least not anymore. "You didn't stay in Nebraska?" he asked. "What was there to stay for?" "It wasn't a question. I went east for a while. Did laundry, cooking, mending, whatever there was. Came west again when I heard there was more honest work out here." A pause. "There's more work anyway." Nathan almost smiled at that. It kept almost happening around her. The document arrived on a Tuesday. Nathan found it on his desk, or what passed for his desk. A heavy table in the front room that he used for ranch paperwork when he came in from checking the east fence line. A sealed envelope with the name Vane and Associates on the return, and inside it, 4 pages of close-printed legal language with a handwritten note from Silas Vane himself. "Mr. Cole, I believe you'll find the attached to be a straightforward water rights agreement that will benefit both your operation and the broader development of the Silver Creek corridor. I'd be pleased to discuss at your earliest convenience." S. Vane. Nathan read it twice. Most of it made sense. Some of it didn't, and he assumed that was just the way legal documents were, full of language that lawyers needed and regular people didn't understand. He left it on the table. Evelyn came in to set the table for supper, saw the pages, and started to move them aside. Then she stopped. Nathan was washing up at the basin and glanced over. She was standing very still, holding the pages, reading. "What?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. She read the first page again, then flipped to the third. Her expression had changed. The neutral, capable look she usually wore had gone somewhere else, replaced by something tighter and quieter. "Where did this come from?" she said. "Land broker named Vane. He's been buying up water rights along Silver Creek. Wants me to sign on." "Don't," she said. He straightened up, reached for the towel. "What?" She laid the pages on the table, smoothed them flat, and pointed at a clause on the third page. "Right here. This language, priority assignment of downstream access rights, shall be transferred in perpetuity to the coordinating entity. That's not a cooperation agreement. That's a deed. You'd be signing away your priority claim to Silver Creek." Nathan came over and looked at where she was pointing. The words were there. They were exactly as dense and unremarkable looking as the rest of the document. "How do you know what that means?" he asked. She looked up at him. Her face was very controlled, but her hands weren't. She was pressing them flat against the table the way you press something down when you don't want it to show. "Because I have seen this before," she said. "Not this document. A document like it. The one that took my father's land." The room was quiet. Outside, one of the horses moved in the paddock. The fire made its small sounds. "You're certain?" Nathan said. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "But I'm certain enough that you should talk to one before you touch that pen." He looked at her for a long moment. She was a cook and housekeeper he had hired 9 days ago. She was 29 years old, 3 weeks off a wagon road, carrying a canvas bag that had seen better decades. She had $13.50 a month, a broken pair of boots she'd repaired herself with wire, and opinions she stated as facts because she had learned the hard way that people didn't listen to uncertainty. She was also the most alert person he had talked to in a long time. "All right," he said. She blinked like she had expected to have to argue harder. "All right? I'll get Thayer out here. He's my lawyer. He can look at it." Something in her shoulders came down slightly. "Good," she said, and went back to setting the table. William Thayer was not a dramatic man. He was 61, compact, dressed in the same brown suit he'd owned for 8 years, and he had a way of listening that made you feel he was writing everything down somewhere inside himself, even when his hands were still. He had been Nathan's attorney for 6 years and had never once told Nathan anything he didn't mean. He came out to the ranch on Thursday. He sat at the table with the Vane document and his own reading glasses and a cup of Evelyn's coffee, and he read for 40 minutes without speaking. Nathan sat across from him. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen, which was where she was supposed to be, and she could hear everything through the open doorway. "Where is the specific language?" Thayer asked finally. "Third page," Nathan said, "the priority assignment clause." Thayer turned to it. "Read it. Read it again." The silence went on long enough that Evelyn came to the doorway, drying a pan, not pretending she wasn't listening. "This is not a water rights agreement," Thayer said quietly. "No," Nathan said. "This is a priority transfer. If you had signed this, Silver Creek's water rights, your upstream priority, would have become the legal property of Vane's coordinating entity within 2 years. Buried in the contingency clauses on page 4, he took his glasses off. "Nathan, whoever identified this clause very likely saved your ranch." Nathan looked toward the kitchen doorway. Thayer followed his gaze. Evelyn was watching them both with an expression that was not satisfaction, nothing as clean as that. It was the expression of someone who had seen this before and had not been able to stop it the first time, and was relieved to God and everything else that she had managed to stop it this time. "The woman in the kitchen," Thayer said. "The woman in the kitchen," Nathan confirmed. Thayer turned to look at her fully. "Ma'am, do you have any legal background?" "No," she said. "I have a father who lost everything to a document like that one. That's all." Thayer nodded slowly. "I'd like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind, about what you saw in that language." "I don't mind," she said, and came to the table and sat down. What Thayer uncovered over the next 4 days was not small. He started with Vane's coordinating entity, a shell company called Territorial Water Holdings, and pulled its registration records from the county office. What he found connected to 3 other shell companies, all registered within the past 2 years, all involved in similar water rights agreements across the territory. He cross-referenced against land dispute records and found 7 cases in 5 counties where ranchers had signed documents nearly identical to the one Vane had delivered to Nathan. Every single one of those ranchers had lost their water priority within 18 months of signing. Some had gone under. Some had been bought out at a fraction of their land's value. Some had simply left, not understanding what had happened to them. Nathan read Thayer's report at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening. Evelyn was washing up. She had not asked to see the report, but Nathan slid it across the table to her when he was done. She read it without speaking. 7 ranchers, she said finally, that Thayer found. He thinks there are more. She set the pages down, pressed them flat again with her palms, that same gesture, that pressing down. What is he going to do? He wants to bring it to Judge Foss in Helena. Emergency filing, but he needs witnesses. Nathan looked at her steadily. People who can testify to what Vane's people did, how the contracts were presented, what language was used. Evelyn was quiet. "You saw the document," Nathan said. "You understood it immediately. Thayer says your testimony, what you recognized, why you recognized it, what happened to your father, would be significant." She stood up and carried a cup to the basin, kept her back to him for a moment. "If I testify," she said carefully, "Vane's people will look into me. What happened in Nebraska, where I've been, what I've done. Is there something there that—" "No," she said, firm. "There's nothing criminal. There's nothing shameful. But there are people who would tell it in a shameful way. Who would take the fact that I left Nebraska with nothing and moved around and worked whatever work I could find and make it sound like I'm not the kind of woman a court should believe?" She turned around. Her expression was direct and tired at the same time, the expression of someone who has had to make this calculation before. "I know what I look like," she said. "I know what people assume when they look at me. They see a big, plain, poor woman who wanders from place to place, and they don't ask why she wanders or what she survived before she got here. They just decide she doesn't count." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "You identified a clause in a contract that 17 years of experience hadn't made my lawyer suspicious of," he said. "You did it in under 10 minutes while setting a supper table." Evelyn looked at him, I think, Nathan said slowly, that if you chose to testify, there's not a person in that courtroom who would walk out thinking you don't count. It was, as compliments went, exactly the right one. Not about how she looked, not about what she'd overcome, about what she actually did. She thought about her father's face the day they left the Nebraska homestead. 30 days' notice. 9 years of work gone in an afternoon because he hadn't known what he was signing. Because no one had been there to read it carefully. Because a man like Silas Vane had counted on him not knowing. There were 7 ranchers in Thayer's report. Maybe more. Tell Mr. Thayer, she said, that I'll testify. It was 10 days before Margaret Whitlock was due to arrive. Nathan sent her a letter. He did not know exactly what to say in it. He sat at his desk for a long time staring at the blank paper, and then he wrote honestly, which was usually the only thing he could do. He told her that the situation at the ranch had developed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told her that he did not think he could be what she was coming here to find. He told her he was sorry for the inconvenience, and that he would of course cover the return travel expenses. He did not mention Evelyn in the letter. It wouldn't have been fair to either woman. He folded it, sealed it, and gave it to Pete to post. Pete said nothing. He took the letter and rode into Ridgeline and said nothing the whole way there and the whole way back. And when he got back, he handed Nathan the receipt from the post office and went to check the south fence. The thing about Pete was that he noticed everything and said only what needed saying. Right now, nothing needed saying. The giant cowboy on the enormous ranch was finally starting to look like he was living in it. And that, as far as Pete was concerned, was not a small thing. The first threat came on a Friday. It wasn't dramatic. That was what was chilling about it. Vane's partner, a man named Ellery Crow, rode onto the property without invitation and found Nathan at the barn. Crow was mid-40s, well-dressed in a way that felt calculated, with the kind of face that had learned to look agreeable, because it found that more useful than looking like what it was. "Mr. Cole," he said, dismounting, "I wanted to speak with you directly about the water agreement. I understand there may have been some confusion." "There was no confusion," Nathan said. He didn't stop what he was doing, which was adjusting a harness. "I had my lawyer look at it. He's already filed with Judge Foss in Helena." Crow went very still. Then he put the agreeable look back on, which took visible effort. "I think there may have been a misreading. I said there was no confusion." Crow looked past him toward the house. His eyes settled on the kitchen window, where Evelyn was visible, moving behind the glass. "Your housekeeper," Crow said. "I've heard she was the one who raised concerns." "My lawyer raised concerns. My housekeeper noticed the clause." Crow looked back at Nathan with an expression that was no longer agreeable. "Mr. Cole, I would think carefully about the kind of people you're taking advice from. A woman like that." Nathan set down the harness, turned, and looked at Crow. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He was 6 feet 5 inches and built like the side of a mountain, and when he turned the full weight of his attention onto something, it tended to make itself very clear. Crow cleared his throat. "I'll be in touch," he said, in a tone that had become a different kind of statement entirely. He remounted and rode out without looking back. Nathan watched him go. Then he turned and walked to the house, went in through the kitchen door, and stood there for a moment while Evelyn looked up from the stove. "That was Ellery Crow," Nathan said. She knew the name from Thayer's report. She didn't say anything. "He's not going to stop," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "He looked at you through the window." She held his gaze. "I know that too." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want you to know that whatever they say about you, whatever they decide to find or make up it, won't change anything here. You work for this ranch and you will be treated accordingly." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She was measuring something, he could tell, deciding how much to trust the statement. "Thank you," she said finally. Careful, not effusive, just genuine. She turned back to the stove. Nathan went to wash up for supper, and neither of them said anything else about it. But outside, Ellery Crow was riding toward Ridgeline, and he was already thinking about the kinds of things that could be said about a woman. Nobody had thought to ask about the kind of story you could build from a few true facts and enough strategic silence. And he was thinking that a woman like Evelyn Bennett was exactly the kind of person who wouldn't be hard to destroy. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. And by the time he did, it would already be too late. Ellery Crow rode back into Ridgeline that same Friday evening and went straight to the back room of the Territorial Trust Office, which was not a trust office in any real sense of the word, but rather the place where Silas Vane conducted business he preferred not to conduct in public. It was a narrow room with one window nailed shut and a desk that had more paper on it than any honest operation would require. Vane was already there, which meant someone had ridden ahead to tell him. Crow sat down without being invited and said, "Cole is already filed with Foss." Vane didn't look up from what he was writing. He was a thin man, 60 or so, with a gray beard kept short and careful, and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent a long time making himself look smaller than he was. It worked. People consistently underestimated Silas Vane right up until the moment they understood they shouldn't have. I know, Vane said. Then you know we have a problem. We have a complication. Vane set down his pen. There's a difference. A problem is something you can't work around. A complication is something you work around. He laced his fingers together on the desktop. Who filed the complaint with Thayer, the woman? The housekeeper Cole hired, big woman, came from Nebraska. Name, Evelyn Bennett. Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, find out everything about her. Where she came from, where she worked, who she knew, what she owes and who she left behind. A pause. A woman like that doesn't come from nowhere. Find out where she came from and what she left in it. Crow nodded. He had done this before. It was not a complicated process. You pulled the threads until something unraveled, and if nothing unraveled, you found a thread that looked like it might and pulled that one instead. And by the time anyone looked closely at what you were holding, the damage was already done. And Cole? Crow said. Vane picked his pen back up. Cole is a rancher. Ranchers understand land. They understand when the ground shifts beneath them. He looked at the paper in front of him. We'll shift the ground. Evelyn didn't sleep well that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, a room she'd made tolerable with a clean quilt from the linen trunk and a candle kept low on the windowsill, and looked at the ceiling and thought about Nebraska. Not about the homestead itself, or her father's face when the land agent had come with the eviction notice. She had thought about those things enough that the memories had worn smooth, like river stones, and didn't cut anymore. What she thought about was the contract, the specific language, the clause she had spotted at 17 that her father hadn't. Because nobody had taught her to read contracts, she had just read everything she could get her hands on, always. And legal language had a particular kind of precision that she had come to recognize the way a person recognizes a voice that's trying not to be recognized. She had told her father. She had sat with him at the kitchen table and pointed to the clause and said, Pa, I don't think this means what they said it means. And her father had looked at it and looked at her and said that surely the land agent wouldn't have misrepresented it, that the man had come recommended by the county office, that Evelyn was smart, but she wasn't a lawyer. He had signed. 30 days later, they were packing everything they owned into 2 wagons. She had spent 12 years carrying that moment. Not in a way that crippled her. She wasn't built for that kind of carrying. But it was there. The knowledge that she had seen it and said so, and not been believed, and that the note being believed had cost her family everything they had built. She had been believed today. Nathan had said all right and meant it, without making her prove herself further, without asking why she was so sure, without looking at her the way people looked at her when she offered an opinion they hadn't asked for. He had just turned toward the problem and started moving. She stared at the ceiling and told herself not to make too much of it. He was a practical man who had gotten practical information and used it. That was all. She told herself that several more times before she fell asleep. Thayer came back out to the ranch on Monday with a second man, a deputy land surveyor named Horace Gill, who had worked for the territorial office for 20 years and had the look of someone who had seen enough irregular paperwork to no longer be surprised by any of it. Gill was there because Thayer had asked him to examine the original survey records for the Silver Creek water rights, the ones that predated Vane's coordinating entity by 11 years. They spread the documents across Nathan's front room table. There were survey maps, deed records, the original water rights filing from 1871, and alongside them the Vane document and the 3 shell company registrations Thayer had pulled from the county office. Gill put on his glasses and looked at the survey maps for a long time. Nobody rushed him. Nathan had learned, working with Thayer, that the moments when a careful man went silent were the moments worth waiting for. Here, Gill said finally. He was pointing at a notation in the margin of the 1874 survey, small and precise. This mark indicates a surveyor's amendment. Somebody changed the boundary notation for the Silver Creek access corridor. He looked up. In the original 1871 filing, the priority access point is here 10 yards upstream of the notation. In 1874, someone moved it. On paper only. The creek didn't move. Thayer looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Gill. Who amended it? Nathan asked. Gill turned to the back of the document, where the surveyor's seal and signature should have been. There was a seal. The signature was partially illegible, smeared in a way that might have been age, or might have been intention. I can't read the name, Gill said. But the seal number is registered to a surveyor who retired in 1876. He took his glasses off. Retired or was retired. There's a difference sometimes. The room was very quiet. Evelyn was in the doorway again. She had not pretended to be elsewhere. Thayer had stopped pretending to be surprised by her presence. If that amendment is fraudulent, Thayer said to Gill, and Vane's document was based on the amended survey, Then the whole chain of title for the Silver Creek priority is corrupted, Gil said. He didn't sound outraged. He sounded tired, which was its own kind of worse. Every water rights agreement Vane has filed in this territory for the past 6 years has been built on a document that shouldn't exist. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Evelyn said, "How many agreements?" Thayer opened his case and pulled out a list he'd compiled from county records. He set it on the table. There were 14 names on it. Nathan looked at the list for a long time. Some of the names he knew. Good ranchers. Men who had worked their land for years and had no idea what had been done to them. In the margin of a survey map in 1874. "We need all of this in Helena," Thayer said. "Gil's testimony, the original surveys, my analysis of the shell companies." He looked at Evelyn. "And your testimony about the clause. About what you recognized and why." "I know," she said. "They will look into your background," Thayer said. He said it directly, without apology, because he was not the kind of man who believed in surprising people with things they needed to prepare for. "I know that too," she said. "Is there anything I should know first? Anything that—" "There's nothing criminal," she said. "There's nothing that would disqualify me. There is the fact that I am who I am, and I look the way I look, and some people will consider that sufficient reason to discount what I say." She looked at him steadily. "I've been living with that my whole life. I know how to speak anyway." Thayer held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, one short nod. "The kind that means I understand and I believe you." "The hearing is scheduled for the first Thursday of October," he said. 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks. The rumor started the following Tuesday. Evelyn found out from Pete Dunbar, who came to the kitchen door that morning, with his hat in his hand and a look on his face like he'd rather be checking fence line in a blizzard than having whatever conversation he was about to have. "There's talk in town," he said. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table and said, "What kind of talk?" Pete sat down. He turned the cup in his hands, which was what he did when he was thinking about how to say something carefully. "Talk that you left your last employer under bad circumstances. That something went missing." Evelyn stood very still. "That's not true," she said. "I know it's not true." "How do you know?" Pete looked up at her. "Because I know what a person looks like when they're hiding something, and you don't look like that. You look like somebody told a lie about you, and you're deciding whether to be more angry or more tired." She sat down across from him. She was, in fact, both things at once, in the proportions that had become familiar over the years, anger sharper and closer to the surface, tiredness deeper and older. "Who's saying it?" she asked. "Various people started at the dry goods. Probably came from Ridgeline." He drank his coffee. The name Crow came up once, indirect-like. She thought about Crow on his horse, looking past Nathan toward the kitchen window. She had known from the moment she saw that look what it meant. She had known it the way you know weather coming, not because you can see it yet, but because you've lived long enough to read the signs. "I need to tell Mr. Cole," she said. "He already knows," Pete said. "He heard it yesterday in town. That's why I'm here. He asked me to tell you before you heard it from someone else." She absorbed this. "He asked you." She said, "Yes, ma'am." "Not to handle it himself. He said you deserve to hear it your own way, not have it managed for you." Pete finished his coffee and stood up. He was not by nature a man who elaborated. "He's in the south barn if you want him." She did want him. She went. Nathan was mending a bridle when she came in. He knew she was there before she said anything. The way she moved had a particular sound, deliberate and even, like someone who had long since made peace with taking up space. "You heard," she said, "yesterday. He kept working on the bridle." I asked around. "The story started at a place called Morrow's Dry Goods. Man behind the counter heard it from a woman who heard it from a rider who'd come in from Ridgeline. He set down the bridle. It's fabricated, all of it." "Yes," she said. "The employer they're naming, I looked into it. There's no record of a theft complaint anywhere in the territory with your name attached." She looked at him. "You checked. I wanted to know what we were actually dealing with." He said it like it was obvious. Like, of course, you'd verify before drawing conclusions. Like doing otherwise wouldn't have occurred to him. That hit her differently than she expected. Not because she had thought he would believe the rumor. She had assessed him well enough by now to doubt that. But because he had gone and checked, actively, without waiting for her to defend herself. He had treated the allegation the way you treat a fence that looks damaged. You go see if it's actually broken before you decide what to do about it. "It's Crow," she said. "He's trying to discredit me before the hearing." "I know, it'll get worse." "Probably," Nathan said. He picked the bridle back up. "Do you want to withdraw the testimony?" She looked at him for a moment. Outside, one of the horses moved. A hand called something across the yard. "No," she said. He nodded, like that was the answer he expected. "Then we deal with it." "How?" He thought about it for a moment. He wasn't a man who performed thinking he actually did it, quietly, without making it into a display. "Thayer needs to know," he said. "He should hear about the rumor directly from you, and you should tell him everything about your work history, every employer. Every town. Not because you owe anyone a defense, but so he can have the facts ready when they try to use the lie. That's a lot of work history, she said. It wasn't quite self-deprecating, more like honest. Then we start making the list now, he said. And you tell it to me first, and I'll help you figure out what Thayer needs. She stared at him. The bridle hung in his enormous hands. The barn was full of the ordinary sounds of horses and morning light coming through the slats. He looked back at her with an expression that was not complicated, just steady and practical, and entirely without calculation. She sat down on a hay bale and started talking. What came out over the next hour and a half was not a heroic account. Evelyn was not inclined toward heroic accounts of herself. It was the actual geography of 12 years, where she'd gone when they left Nebraska, what she'd worked, how long she'd stayed, and why she'd left. There had been a family in Omaha where she'd cooked for 3 years before the wife's illness ended the household. A boarding house in Cheyenne where she'd managed laundry and meals for 14 men for 2 winters, until the owner sold the building and the whole operation disbanded. A ranch near Casper, where she'd stayed 8 months before the foreman's behavior made staying untenable, which she reported to the owner, who had not believed her, which meant she chose to leave on her terms before she was pushed. Then a season of piecework, mending, preserving, occasional harvest, cooking through 3 counties, staying nowhere long enough to put down roots. Not because she wanted to wander, but because the work was seasonal, and the options were what they were. Nathan listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions, both practical: the name of the Casper Ranch and the name of the boarding house owner in Cheyenne. He was writing on a folded piece of paper he'd pulled from his shirt pocket, the handwriting large and unhurried. When she was done, he looked at what he'd written. None of that gives Crow anything real to work with, he said. He doesn't need anything real, she said. He just needs something that sounds real to people who want a reason not to believe me. That's different from actually having something. Is it? She looked at him levelly. In a courtroom, it might be different. In a town's opinion, it's less different than it should be. He couldn't argue with that. He didn't try to. Then we make sure Thayer can counter everything they raise. And if they invent something that can't be countered because it never happened? Nathan looked at her. Then you stand up in front of Judge Foss and you say it didn't happen, and I stand there with you, and we let Thayer show the court what Crow actually is. She looked down at her hands for a moment. They were a cook's hands, reddened at the knuckles, calloused, capable. She had worked hard enough with them that they barely looked like a woman's hands anymore, though she had long since stopped thinking about that. Why, she said. He looked at her. Why does it matter to you, she asked, not suspiciously. Genuinely, you have the evidence you need. Thayer has the survey documents, the shell company records, the amended notation. You could win this without me. The other ranchers on Vane's list don't know me. You don't owe me anything beyond my wages. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. You're the one who saw us, he said. In 10 minutes at my kitchen table, while setting up for supper. You saw what Thayer took 3 days to find, that matters. He met her eyes. And you told me, even though you didn't have to. You could have set those pages aside and said nothing. It wasn't your fight. She didn't say anything. It is now, he said. That's what it means when you get into a fight, it becomes yours. And once it's yours, you don't stand alone in it. That's not how I run things. She held his gaze for a long moment. He wasn't performing it. He wasn't saying it to make her feel grateful or beholden. He was simply telling her how he understood the world to work, the way you tell someone which road leads where matter-of-factly. Because it's true. All right, she said. He nodded. I'll send word to Thayer today. The letter that arrived 4 days later was not from Thayer. It was addressed to Evelyn directly, written in a hand that was careful and deliberate in the way that people write when they want the words to feel official. The envelope had no return address. She read it at the kitchen table after breakfast, while the hands were out and the house was quiet. Miss Bennett, you would do well to consider your position carefully before the hearing in Helena. A woman of your circumstances, making serious accusations against established businessmen, can expect serious consequences. There are people who remember certain things about your time in Nebraska and your subsequent travels, things that would not reflect well in a court of law. We advise you to withdraw your testimony and leave the territory at your earliest convenience. This offer is extended once. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table, smoothed it flat with her palms, and sat with it for a moment. There was a line in the letter, a woman of your circumstances, that she thought about, particularly. It was doing a specific kind of work. It wasn't threatening her with anything provable. It was threatening her with the idea of what other people might think, with the weight of implication, with the accumulated social pressure of being the kind of woman who could be made to look like the problem without anyone having to prove anything specific. It was the same weapon Crow had used with the rumor at the dry goods store, made explicit. She got up, went to the front room, and found Nathan at his desk. This came for me, she said, and set it down in front of him. He read it. His jaw went tighter as he read, which was the only outward sign. When he was done, he set it back on the desk and looked at it the way he might look at a stretch of fence line that someone had deliberately cut. Thayer, he said. Yes, she said. He'll need to see it. This is evidence. Nathan picked it up carefully by the edges. This is a threatening letter, sent to a witness in an active legal proceeding. He looked at her. This is not just evidence against Vane. This is a crime. She hadn't thought of it quite that way, though she should have. She had been too busy thinking of it as a thing she needed to survive, rather than a thing that could be used against the people who sent it. They made a mistake, she said. A significant one. She almost smiled. It wasn't funny exactly, but there was something in the situation that required either a laugh or a scream, and she had more practice managing the scream. Nathan rode into Ridgeline that afternoon with the letter. He came back with Thayer's written response, scrawled on a piece of office paper in Thayer's cramped, urgent hand, which said 3 things. Keep the envelope. Keep the letter. Tell no one else. And be in Helena the Tuesday before the hearing. Thayer had also added a postscript. They are more frightened than we thought. Good. The hearing was 3 weeks away, and the 2 weeks before it were not easy. The rumor about the theft didn't die, it mutated. The second week it had become a rumor about 2 thefts, one of them involving cash. Evelyn heard about it from a woman in Ridgeline named Mrs. Aldrich, who ran the laundry and had apparently decided to tell Evelyn directly rather than continue hearing it secondhand, which was either an act of decency or morbid curiosity or some combination of both. I don't believe it, Mrs. Aldrich said, handing Evelyn her wrapped parcel of shirts. For what it's worth. Thank you, Evelyn said. But people are talking, the woman said. You know how people talk, I do, Evelyn said. She paid for the shirts and walked out. The men at the ranch were careful around her in a way they hadn't been. Before, not unkind, but careful. A kind of heightened courtesy that was its own acknowledgement that something uncomfortable was in the air. All except Pete Dunbar, who treated her exactly the same as he always had, which was the most decent thing he could have done. One evening she came in from the garden to find 2 of the hands in the kitchen doorway, clearly having stopped a conversation when they heard her. She didn't ask what they'd been saying. She washed her hands and started supper, and they moved off, and nobody said anything about it. That night Nathan was late coming in. She had kept the stew warm and was sitting at the table reading when he came through the kitchen door, and he looked like a man who had been having a bad day and knew it showed. He sat down without being asked. She served him stew and sat back down with her book. After a few minutes, he said, I rode out to talk to the Mercer family today. They're on Thayer's list. She looked up. Albert Mercer signed Vane's agreement 2 years ago, Nathan said. He's a small rancher south of the creek. His wife is sick and they've got 3 kids. He had no idea what he signed. He looked at his bowl. He cried when I told him what the agreement actually did. He's 51 years old, and he sat in his kitchen and cried like he stopped, pressed his lips together. Evelyn didn't say anything. She let the silence do what it needed to. I should have known about this earlier, Nathan said. If I hadn't been so focused on my own operation. You wouldn't have known, she said. That's how this kind of scheme works. It's designed so you don't know. So everything looks legal and reasonable until you sign. And then by the time you understand what happened, it's too late and there's nothing to trace. She paused. My father didn't know either. Knowing doesn't always mean you had a chance to know. He looked at her. How many families do you think there are? That we haven't found yet? I don't know, she said honestly. Thayer's found 14. I think there are more. Nathan nodded. He ate his stew. The fire worked at the wood. Will you come with me when I ride out to the others, he said, before the hearing. To tell them what happened, what the hearing is for, that there's a chance to fix it. She looked at him. You want me to come? You know how to explain the contracts, he said, in a way people understand. You did it for me. A pause. And you've been where they are. She thought about her father again. Not the man at the kitchen table before the eviction, the man afterward. The way he had folded into himself in the weeks that followed, quietly and steadily, like a fire going out in a house with no one left to tend it. Yes, she said, I'll come. They rode out to 4 ranches over the following 10 days. Each time, Nathan made the introduction and explained the hearing, and then Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, always the kitchen table, always the same table that existed in every working family's home, the table where the actual business of surviving got done, and explained what the contract had done. She did it without making them feel stupid. That was the thing she had to be careful about, the thing she had learned from watching her father absorb the understanding of what he'd signed. You could explain a fraud to someone in a way that was really about telling them they should have known better, and that was worse than saying nothing. You had to explain it in a way that made clear that the deception was the skill of the deceiver, not the failing of the deceived. She got better at it each time. The language became more precise. She learned which parts to simplify and which parts to explain fully, because the people in these kitchens were not unintelligent. They were just people who had trusted a system that had been designed to betray their trust, and now they needed to understand the specific shape of the betrayal in order to testify to it. At the third ranch, a couple named Sutherland, older, no children left at home. The wife, Clara, walked Evelyn out to the yard when they were leaving, and stood there in the late afternoon light with her arms crossed against the cold. "How do you do it?" Clara Sutherland said. Evelyn stopped. "Do what?" "Stand up in front of all of it. The talk, and the letters, and whatever else they're going to do. I heard what they said about you in town. I don't believe it, but I heard it. How do you keep?" She made a gesture that encompassed everything. The situation, the hearing, the whole complicated weight of it. "How do you not just walk away?" Evelyn thought about it for a moment. She owed the woman an honest answer, not a brave one. "I walked away once," she said, "when I was 17, and I told my father what was in that contract, and he didn't listen, and I watched us lose everything. I didn't fight harder for it. I was 17 and I didn't know how, and I walked away with him when we had to go." She looked out across the Sutherland ranch, the land going gold in the low sun. "I have been thinking about that moment for 12 years. About what I knew and what I should have done with what I knew." She looked back at Clara. "I'm not walking away again, that's all." Clara Sutherland looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded a sharp, definitive nod, the kind that means something has been decided. "Then neither are we," Clara said. 2 days before they were due to leave for Helena, Crow made his second approach. This time he didn't ride onto the ranch property. He waited at the crossroads where the ranch road met the main track into Ridgeline, and he waited for Nathan specifically, which meant he had someone watching the ranch to know when Nathan would be riding alone. Nathan saw him and stopped. "I want to make this easy," Crow said. He was on a good horse, dressed well, the agreeable expression running at full effort. "You're a reasonable man, Cole. You've built something real here. This hearing is going to be messy for everyone. The territory press will cover it. Your name will be attached to a complicated story about land fraud and water rights. And whatever the outcome, that kind of coverage is bad for business." Nathan looked at him. "Withdraw your cooperation with Thayer," Crow said. "Let the filing go cold. Vane will release the water agreement entirely. You keep all your rights, no conditions. The woman leaves the territory. We stop discussing her past. Everybody walks away clean." The offer was not irrational from a certain point of view. Nathan recognized that. The kind of point of view that believed everything had a number and a person just needed to find it. "The woman's name is Evelyn Bennett," Nathan said. "And she doesn't go anywhere." Something in Crow's face shifted. The agreeable expression slipped enough to show what was underneath it, just briefly, like a cloud moving across the wrong kind of sky. "You're protecting a housekeeper," Crow said. "Not quite a question. Not quite, not one. I'm protecting 14 ranchers who signed your contracts because they trusted a legal system that was being run by you in vain for your own benefit," Nathan said. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, without performance. "And I'm protecting the woman who saw what none of the rest of us saw in time to stop it." He gathered his reins. "If you're at this crossroads when I ride back this afternoon, I'll take it as a statement of intent, and I'll respond accordingly." He rode past Crow without looking back. Crow watched him go. When Nathan was out of sight, Crow turned his horse and rode toward Ridgeline at a pace that said the conversation in Vane's back room that evening was not going to be a comfortable one. They left for Helena on a Tuesday morning, Nathan and Evelyn and Thayer, along with Horace Gill, and 3 of the ranchers from Thayer's list who had agreed to testify. Albert Mercer was one of them. Clara Sutherland was another, traveling without her husband, who was too sick to make the trip but had given a written statement that Thayer had spent an evening preparing with him. Pete Dunbar stayed behind to run the ranch. Before they rode out, he came to Evelyn at the gate and held out his hand, not like a man offering a handshake, but like a man who has decided something needs doing, and this is the appropriate gesture for it. She shook it. "You'll do fine," Pete said. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you will anyway." The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October morning in Montana that looked like a clean sheet of paper. They rode out with the sun coming up behind them, throwing long shadows onto the road ahead. And Evelyn sat her horse and watched the ranch get smaller behind her, and thought that she had, in 12 years of moving, almost never looked back. She looked back now, not with regret, with something she didn't have a clean word for yet. Then she turned around and rode toward Helena and whatever was waiting there. Helena was bigger than Evelyn had expected and louder than she had prepared for. She had been to Cheyenne, which was a proper city by frontier standards, and she had passed through Billings once on a wagon job 3 years back. But Helena had a different energy, the concentrated pressure of a place that knew it was becoming important and was not entirely comfortable with the weight of it. The streets were wide and rutted from heavy traffic, lined with buildings that ranged from solid brick to raw timber that still smelled like sap. And everywhere there were people moving with the particular purposefulness of people who had things to prove and limited time to prove them. They arrived Tuesday evening, road-worn and quiet, in the way that long travel makes people quiet. Thayer had arranged rooms at a boarding house on Benton Avenue run by a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who was efficient and incurious, which were exactly the qualities the situation required. She showed them each to their rooms without ceremony and said breakfast was at 7, and that was the extent of the welcome. Evelyn's room was small and clean, with a window that looked out over a back alley, and beyond it the roof lines of the city against the darkening sky. She sat on the edge of the bed and felt the particular exhaustion of traveling, while anxious, the kind that sits in your shoulders and your jaw rather than your legs. She had said very little on the road. So had Nathan, which she had appreciated. There was nothing left to strategize about. Thayer had covered every angle he could cover. What remained now was the doing of it, and you couldn't strategize your way through that. She washed her face at the basin and looked at herself in the small mirror above it. She was not in the habit of studying her reflection for long. She looked at it long enough to see what other people saw first: the broad face, the thick neck, the heaviness of her frame, even after a week of anxious eating less than usual, and then she looked past all of that to the thing she actually needed to assess, which was whether her eyes looked clear and steady. They did. She dried her face and went to bed and slept better than she had expected to. Thayer called them together Wednesday morning in the small parlor at the back of Mrs. Pratt's boarding house. He had papers spread across the table and looked like a man who had not slept, which was confirmed by the 3 empty coffee cups arranged beside his elbow. Nathan, Evelyn, Albert Mercer, Clara Sutherland, and Horace Gill arranged themselves around the table. Thayer stood at the head of it. "The hearing is Thursday at 10, he said without preamble. Judge Harlan Foss presiding. Foss is thorough, direct, and not patient with theatrical arguments. Don't try to impress him. Answer what you're asked and stop. He'll pull the thread himself if he wants more." He looked around the table. Vane's counsel is a man named Beaumont Sear. I've appeared against Sear twice before. He is very good at making complicated things sound simple and simple things sound complicated. He will attempt to make this case about credibility rather than evidence. That is his play, and we need to understand it. Mercer shifted in his chair. He was a compact, weathered man who carried his anxiety the way he probably carried everything close and controlled, not much showing on the outside. "What does credibility mean in this context?" he asked. "It means he will try to argue that the witnesses against Vane are either mistaken, motivated by self-interest, or not qualified to interpret the documents they claim to have read." Thayer's gaze moved briefly to Evelyn and away. He will specifically target any witness he can characterize as an outsider, as inexperienced, or as having personal grievances that distort their testimony. There was a silence. "He means me," Evelyn said. "He may argue that your history, the loss of your father's homestead, your subsequent circumstances makes you predisposed to see fraud, even where it doesn't exist. That you pattern-matched a familiar shape onto a document that, Sear will argue, was legitimately constructed. The survey amendment," Gill said, "that's the anchor. That's not interpretation. That's a physical document with a forged notation." "It is," Thayer said, "and it is our strongest piece. But Sear will try to argue the amendment was clerical, not fraudulent. He'll bring his own surveyor to cast doubt on my reading of the seal." Nathan had his arms folded on the table, looking at Thayer steadily. "What do you need from each of us?" From Gill, precision. "Don't offer opinions, only what the documents show." From Mercer and Mrs. Sutherland, specific testimony about how the agreements were presented to you. The exact language Vane's agents used. What they said verbally versus what the document contained. Thayer paused. From Evelyn, clarity. "You need to explain what you saw in the Vane document, why you recognized it, and the connection to your father's experience. You need to do it without sounding like a grievance. You need to sound like a witness." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do," Thayer said. "I'm telling you anyway because Sear will try to blur it. He will ask you questions designed to make you sound angry. Stay on what you know. If you don't know something, say so. If you know something very well, say that clearly too." He looked at Nathan last. "You don't testify," Thayer said. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something in him went still. "Why not?" "Because your testimony is the least essential and the most risky. You're the plaintiff. Sear will use your testimony to argue this is a wealthy rancher protecting his water rights, not a civic action against a criminal scheme. Other witnesses make the broader case. You make it look personal." He met Nathan's eyes. "I know that's not easy to hear. It wasn't." Nathan sat with it for a moment. Then he nodded. One short nod, the same gesture Evelyn had made when Thayer had told her the same kind of thing. "All right," he said. The territorial courthouse in Helena was a brick building on Lawrence Street with a front door that was slightly too narrow for Nathan. who had to angle his shoulders to get through it, which was the kind of absurd detail that Evelyn found herself noticing, because her mind needed somewhere to put itself while the rest of her focused on staying calm. They arrived at 9:30. The courtroom was already filling, not packed, but fuller than she had expected for an administrative hearing. There were journalists. She spotted them immediately, the way you spot people who are watching rather than participating. 2 men with notebooks near the back wall. Someone from what looked like the territorial press. News had traveled farther than Thayer had apparently anticipated, which showed on his face briefly when he scanned the room. Vane was there. He was seated at the table, across the aisle, which was the first time Evelyn had seen him in person, rather than in the shape of his documents and his reputation. He was smaller than she had expected, physically small, carefully dressed, with a composure that had the particular quality of composure that is maintained rather than natural. Beside him sat Beaumontseer, who was large and well-dressed, in the way of a man who understood that a certain size of presence was itself an argument. Crow was not in the room. She noted that and filed it. Nathan settled into the seat beside Evelyn in the gallery. He had been told he wouldn't testify, and he had accepted it, but she had the sense that accepting it and being comfortable with it were different things for him. He was built for action. Sitting while other people handled a fight on his behalf was not where he was most comfortable. She could see it in the set of his jaw. Without thinking about it, she said quietly, "You being here matters." He looked at her. "To the people in this room who came from those ranches," she said. "They see Nathan Cole sitting in this courtroom instead of being too busy or too comfortable to bother. That means something." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his jaw loosened slightly. "You have an annoying habit of being right," he said quietly. "I know," she said, and turned to face the front of the courtroom. Judge Harlan Foss was 63, with a face like compressed wood and the kind of physical economy of movement that suggested a man who had long since decided that anything unnecessary was a waste. He came in without ceremony, sat, looked at the room as though taking inventory of it, and said, "We'll begin." Thayer opened the case methodically. He presented the survey documents, the shell company registrations, the chain of title analysis. Horace Gill testified for 40 minutes about the amended survey notation, using language so precise and careful that even Sear's cross-examination found nothing productive to pull at. Sear brought his own surveyor, a man named Pickard, who was clearly uncomfortable and whose testimony Gill quietly dismantled on redirect by pointing to a specific registration code on the amendment seal that corresponded to a practitioner who had been dead since 1879. The courtroom went noticeably quiet after that. Albert Mercer testified next. He was nervous. His hands shook slightly on the railing, but nervousness was not the same as unreliable. And when Sear tried to imply that Mercer had signed the agreement knowing what it contained, Mercer looked at him with the flat steadiness of a man who had cried in his kitchen in front of Nathan Cole and decided he was done being ashamed of not knowing what he hadn't been told and said, "I signed what the agent told me was a cooperation agreement. If it had said what it actually said, I would not have signed it. That is the truth, and I'll say it as many times as you need me to." Clara Sutherland was brief, precise, and unshakable. She testified to a specific conversation with Vane's agent, what he had said verbally, the exact phrase routine water sharing arrangement, and then stated flatly that the clause on page 3 of the document she had been given bore no relationship to that description. Sear tried twice to suggest her memory of the conversation was imprecise. Both times she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been managing a working ranch for 30 years and said that her memory was adequate and that she had committed the conversation to writing the evening after it occurred, which she had not been asked about previously but would be happy to share. Thayer presented the written note. The courtroom went quiet again. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She walked to the stand with her back straight and her hands loose at her sides. She had spent the previous evening not rehearsing, but rather trying to locate the right register, the place between anger and detachment where testimony lived. Not the register of a wronged woman. Not the register of a woman trying to seem harmless. The register of someone who had seen a specific thing and could describe it specifically. Thayer took her through the initial questions carefully. Her full name, her occupation, how she had come to be employed at the Cole Ranch, what she had seen the evening of the Tuesday when the Vane document arrived. She answered precisely. She said she had been setting the table when she moved the document aside, and the language on the 3rd page had caught her attention. She said she had read the 1st page and the 3rd page before saying anything. She said she had not been certain the language was fraudulent, but had been certain enough that it needed to be read by someone with legal training. "Why were you paying close attention to a document that was not addressed to you?" Thayer asked. "I pay close attention to documents because I once didn't pay enough attention to one," she said. Or more accurately, I paid attention and I was not believed, and I should have fought harder. That is something I've thought about for 12 years. Can you explain what you mean? She explained. She told it factually. Without performance, her father's Nebraska homestead, the land agent, the contract with the clause that transferred the homestead's title, under conditions her father hadn't understood. She described pointing it out to her father. She described being dismissed. She described the 30-day notice that came afterward. Were you correct in your reading of that clause? Thayer asked. Yes. How can you be certain, since the outcome was? Because 4 years after we left, another family bought the land from the entity that had acquired it through the contract. They hired a lawyer to examine the title, and the lawyer found the fraudulent clause and flagged it in a county dispute record. I obtained a copy of that record in 1879. She paused. The clause was identical in structure to what I had identified at 17. I keep a copy. A sound moved through the courtroom. Not dramatic, more like a collective adjustment, the sound of a group of people recalibrating something. When you read the Vane document, Thayer said, what specifically did you recognize? The priority assignment language on page 3. The phrase transferred in perpetuity to the coordinating entity. In my father's contract, the equivalent clause read permanently conveyed to the managing association. The structure is identical. The water rights version adds the coordinating entity language to obscure which entity receives the transfer. But the mechanism is the same. A priority claim is signed away without the signatory understanding that's what they're doing, because the clause is embedded in language describing routine cooperation. She was watching the judge as she said it. Foss was writing. Then Sear rose for cross-examination. He was measured about it initially. He established her educational background. She had not attended school past 14, which was not unusual for the period, but which he made sound like a disqualification. He asked about her work history. Moving through it, the way you move through undergrowth, you're looking for something in. She answered each question with the same level tone. Then he said, Miss Bennett, you've described yourself as someone who recognized a fraudulent document based on a pattern you saw 12 years ago. Would you say you came to Mr. Cole's ranch already suspicious of land contracts generally? I came to Mr. Cole's ranch looking for work as a cook, she said, but with a pre-existing suspicion of certain kinds of legal language. With experience of a specific kind of fraud, that's not suspicion. That's knowledge. Is there a meaningful difference, in your view? Yes, she said. Suspicion is a feeling. Knowledge is based on evidence. I can show you the evidence. Sear paused. He hadn't expected that response in quite that form. You mentioned a county record from 1879, he said. You obtained this record yourself? I wrote to the county office in York, Nebraska, and requested a copy. I paid 20 cents for it. Do you have it with you? Mr. Thayer has it. She did not look at Thayer. She kept her eyes on Sear. I gave it to him 2 weeks ago when we discussed my testimony. Thayer was already producing it. This was not a surprise to Thayer, because she had told him about the record the day she agreed to testify, and he had asked for it, and she had sent for it immediately. What was a surprise to Sear was visible on his face, a brief recalibration, quickly managed. He tried a different direction. Your background involves considerable movement, he said. Multiple employers across several territories over a 12-year period. Yes, she said. Is it fair to say you've had difficulty maintaining stable employment? No, she said. It's fair to say I've done seasonal and household work across a region where stable employment of that kind is not consistently available to women without family connections. Those are different things. There are rumors. Objection, Thayer said. He had been waiting for it. Judge Foss looked at Sear. You'll present evidence, Mr. Sear, not rumors. Sear inclined his head. My apologies, Your Honor, I'll rephrase. He looked at Evelyn. Are you aware of a complaint made against you by a former employer regarding missing funds? There is no such complaint, she said. Are you aware of one or not? I am aware of a rumor, she said. A rumor that began appearing in Ridgeline approximately 2 weeks after I agreed to testify in this proceeding. I received a letter, Mr. Thayer has this letter as well, advising me to withdraw my testimony and leave the territory. She looked at Sear without looking away. The timing of the rumor and the letter is something Judge Foss may wish to consider. The courtroom was very quiet. Foss looked up from his writing. He looked at Evelyn for a moment, then at Sear, then at Thayer. Mr. Thayer, Foss said the letter. Thayer stood and presented it. He had held it specifically for this moment. This was something he and Evelyn had planned, the timing of producing it, because the sequence mattered. Let Sear try to use the rumors, then present the letter that showed who generated them and why. Foss read it. His expression did not change because his expression rarely did, but his stillness had a different quality when he set the letter down. Mr. Sear, Foss said. Your client is aware of this letter? Sear was managing his face with visible effort. Your Honor, I'm not aware of the document's origins. Then I suggest you become aware, Foss said. in a tone that ended that line of questioning as definitively as a door being locked. He looked at Evelyn. "You may continue, Miss Bennett. Tell me in your own words what you identified in the Vane document and why you believe it represents the same mechanism as the contract that defrauded your father's homestead." And Evelyn told him. She told it carefully and completely, without hurrying and without performing. She identified the clause, she explained the mechanism, she described the comparison to the Nebraska document, and she walked through the specific language that embedded the transfer so deep in the cooperation framework that a person reading for the purpose described in the agreement's title would never reach it with the right kind of attention. She spoke for 14 minutes. Nobody interrupted. When she finished, Foss said, "Thank you," and wrote something at the bottom of his page. The recess came at midday. Evelyn walked out of the courtroom into the corridor and stood against the wall for a moment, with her eyes closed, because her legs wanted to shake, and she would not let them shake in the courtroom, and now they needed a moment to do it. Nathan was beside her almost immediately. He didn't touch her arm or say that she had done well, because he was not a man who offered reassurances when the thing wasn't over. What he did was stand close enough that she could feel the solid fact of his presence, 6 feet 5 inches of actual weight and substance. And it worked the way actual things work, not by comfort, but by reality. "Sear tried to use the rumors," she said. "I saw." The letter stopped him. It did. She opened her eyes. The corridor was full of people milling, talking in low voices. She could see Mercer talking to his wife, who had driven up that morning to be in the courtroom. Clara Sutherland was standing near the window, very straight, watching the street below. "Crow wasn't in the room," Evelyn said. Nathan had noticed the same thing. "No," he said. "Why?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet." That was an honest answer. It was also the wrong kind of answer, the kind that meant a thing not yet understood was still moving somewhere it shouldn't be. Thayer found them during recess with an expression Evelyn had not seen on him before. He was a controlled man, and his face did not do much, which was why the current state of it, something between urgency and careful management of urgency, was notable. He steered them to an empty alcove near the back stairwell. "Crow was arrested this morning," he said. Nathan went still. "Marshal's office here in Helena. There's a warrant from Billings County, a fraud complaint from 3 years ago, a land dispute involving a family named Hartley. Someone in Billings matched Crow's name to the complaint when Thayer's filing started circulating through the territorial network last week." He looked at Nathan specifically. "The warrant has been sitting unsigned for 18 months because the Hartley family couldn't afford to pursue it. When the network filing hit the right office, a deputy connected it." "Who authorized the Billings warrant?" Nathan asked. "A judge named Calder. He's been sitting on it, apparently, waiting for corroborating evidence from another county." Thayer paused. "Our filing was the corroborating evidence." Evelyn looked at him. "So the complaint about me, the rumor, the letter, all of that came from a man who was already wanted. A man who is now in custody and cannot testify on Vane's behalf this afternoon," Thayer said. She thought about that. About the architecture of it. Crow arrested, Vane's case collapsing around the edges, the letter sitting in front of Judge Foss. Everything that had been designed to destroy her testimony was now wrapped around itself. "They overplayed it," she said, substantially, Thayer said. "The letter was the mistake. Threatening a witness in an active territorial proceeding is not a misdemeanor." Nathan looked at him. "What does this mean for the afternoon?" "It means Sear is walking back into that courtroom knowing that his client's partner is in the Helena City jail and that the judge has a witness intimidation letter in his file." Thayer squared his papers. "I've never seen Beaumont Sear look the way he looked when the marshal's deputy handed me the notification just now. I want to enjoy that for one moment before we go back in." He paused. He almost smiled. Then he went back in. The afternoon session was different in its texture. Sear was still good. He was too experienced to collapse visibly, but the energy had gone out of his approach. He argued the survey amendment was clerical, which Gill's testimony had already made nearly impossible to sustain. He argued the shell companies were a legitimate business structure, which the registration dates and the 14 rancher files made look absurd. He tried once more to characterize the witnesses as motivated by personal grievance, and Foss stopped him mid-sentence with a look that required no words. Foss asked his own questions. He was methodical and specific. He asked Gill to walk through the survey seal registration a second time. He asked Mercer to read aloud the exact phrase the land agent had used when presenting the agreement. He asked Clara Sutherland what the agent's response had been when she asked about the priority clause specifically. He said it was standard language, Clara said. He said everyone's contract had it. He said I'd need to worry about it. "And you signed?" "My husband signed. I was standing beside him. The agent was in a hurry. He said the price on the water allocation would go up if we waited." She looked at Foss directly. "We've been ranching that land for 19 years. We weren't going to lose water rights over a few more days of reading." Except that was exactly what the contract was designed to make us feel. Foss wrote that down. Toward the end of the afternoon, Foss addressed Sear directly. I want to understand your client's position regarding Territorial Water Holdings' relationship to Silver Creek priority records dating to 1871. Sear's answer was 15 minutes of carefully constructed language that said essentially very little. Foss listened to all of it. Then he said, Mr. Sear, I'm going to be direct with you. The documentation before this court describes a systematic pattern of contract fraud targeting territorial landholders, supported by a forged survey amendment, conducted through shell entities designed to obscure the principal beneficiary. This is not a gray area. This is a scheme. He set down his pen. I'm suspending the water rights agreement filed against the coal ranch, and all 14 agreements identified in Mr. Thayer's filing, effective immediately. I'm referring the Vane filing to the Territorial Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation, and the witness intimidation letter will accompany that referral. He looked at Vane. It was a brief look. It didn't need to be long. You are not to leave Helena pending the attorney's review, Foss said. Mr. Sear, you'll advise your client accordingly. He closed his folder. Court is adjourned. It was not loud when it happened. Not the way dramatic moments were sometimes loud. People in the gallery talked, but quietly, in the way that people talk when they're absorbing something rather than reacting to it. Mercer sat for a long moment with his hands pressed flat on his knees, not moving, before his wife put her arm around him and he finally bent his head. Clara Sutherland stood up, straightened her coat, and walked to the door with the composure of a woman who had expected nothing to be easy, and had therefore not been destroyed when it wasn't. At the door she stopped and looked back at Evelyn. She gave a single sharp nod. Then she left. Thayer was already at the defendant's table, exchanging sharp, quiet words with Sear. Nathan was standing, and Evelyn realized that at some point during the adjournment, he had moved from the gallery seat to beside her, without ceremony, just present in the way that he was present when something needed being present for. It's not over, Evelyn said. No, Nathan said. The criminal referral has to go through. Vane's people will contest. It'll take time, and the other ranchers, the ones who aren't on Thayer's list. We'll find them, he said. She looked at the front of the room where Vane was speaking to Sear in a low, tight voice. Vane's composure had held throughout the day. It was holding still, technically, but it had a quality now like ice that started to go soft, still a surface, but no longer trustworthy. He doesn't look scared, she said. Men like that don't look scared when they're scared, Nathan said. They look contained. He paused. He's scared. She thought he was probably right. She thought about her father's Nebraska land, about the 9 years it had taken to build what had been taken in an afternoon, about the county record she had kept for 12 years in the bottom of her canvas bag, moved from Omaha to Cheyenne to Casper, to here, always the bottom of the bag, always there. She had not thought of herself as carrying it toward something specific. She had just carried it because she couldn't put it down. It had done something today, that piece of paper. In the hands of a judge who was looking for the right kind of truth in the right kind of order, it had done something real. She wasn't done. She knew that. The referral had to move through the attorney's office. Vane's lawyers would fight every stage of it. The other ranchers were still out there, not knowing what had happened to their land. It was not finished, but it was started. And that was different from where it had been this morning. They were outside on Lawrence Street when Nathan looked at her and said, "Are you hungry?" She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say at this specific moment, that was not among them. "Yes," she said, and realized she genuinely was. She had eaten almost nothing since breakfast. "There's a place on Rodney Street Thayer recommended," he said. "He won't be joining us for at least an hour. He's still dealing with the filings." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to have supper with you." She looked back at him, not at the statement itself, which was simple enough, but at the fact of it, at the fact of this enormous man who had everything he had built and almost lost more, standing on a courthouse street in Helena and asking if she'd like to have supper with him, as though it were the most natural question in the world. And maybe, from where he was standing, it actually was. "All right," she said. They walked to Rodney Street. The evening was coming in cold and clear, the way Montana evenings came in when the day had been sharp. Their boots on the boardwalk made a sound that was companionable in its irregularity, his step long, hers even, neither of them adjusting for the other, and somehow keeping pace anyway. The restaurant was plain and warm. They sat across from each other at a table by the window, and a girl brought them coffee before they'd even asked for it, which felt, in that moment, like the most welcome thing in the world. Nathan wrapped his hands around his cup. He was looking at the table, and she could see him working toward something, not a man who found the right words quickly, but a man who didn't say them until he had them. "In the courtroom today," he said finally, "when you were testifying." He stopped. "Try it again. I've seen men stand up in difficult situations. Men I've worked with for years. Men I'd trust with almost anything. He looked at her. I've never seen anyone hold a room the way you held that room. She looked at him for a moment. This was the second time he had complimented her in a way that was specifically right, not about how she looked, not about what she'd overcome, but about what she had actually done in an actual moment. It kept catching her off guard because she was not accustomed to it and didn't yet have a practiced way to receive it. I was terrified, she said. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She looked at her coffee. Outside, Helena went about its evening business. A wagon passed, someone's dog, a woman with a basket. She thought about Crow in the Helena jail, and Vane in whatever room he was inhabiting now with his contained fear. She thought about the 18 families whose agreements Foss had just suspended, 18 families who did not yet know what had happened today, who would have to be told, who would have to be helped through the next stage of it. She thought about the legal fund she had been turning over in her mind since the week before, the rough shape of an idea she hadn't yet said out loud to anyone. There was more to do. There always was. But tonight there was hot coffee and the sound of a city settling into evening and a man across a table who looked at her and saw what she actually was, rather than what she looked like. And she was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, not in a hurry to leave. They stayed in Helena 2 more days. Thayer needed the time to file the supplementary paperwork, to coordinate with the territorial attorney's office, and to begin the process of notifying the 18 families whose agreements Foss had suspended. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that happened in offices with bad light and too much paper, and it required Thayer's full attention from early morning until the clerks locked the building in the evening. Nathan and Evelyn were not needed for most of it. Thayer was precise about what he required from each person and did not ask for more than that. So they were unexpectedly in Helena with time that wasn't spoken for. The first morning, Nathan went to find the Territorial Land Records office and spent 3 hours there with a clerk who owed Thayer a professional courtesy, pulling deed records for the counties adjacent to the ones already in Thayer's file. He came back to Mrs. Pratt's boarding house at noon with 3 more names ranchers who had signed Vane-related agreements that hadn't made it into the original filing because they were in different counties under slightly different shell company names. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when he came in. Mrs. Pratt had allowed her the use of it in exchange for helping with breakfast, writing a letter to the York County office in Nebraska. She had been thinking about the Nebraska restitution question since before the hearing. There was a process, Thayer had told her once, for contesting fraudulent land transfers after the fact, especially when there was documented evidence. It was slow and expensive and usually not worth pursuing. But Thayer also had a contact in the Nebraska Territorial Bar, and the county record she had kept in the bottom of her canvas bag for 12 years had just been submitted as evidence in a successful fraud proceeding. The landscape, in other words, was somewhat different than it had been. She didn't tell Nathan what the letter was. It wasn't that she was hiding it, she simply wasn't ready to speak it yet. Saying it aloud would make it something she expected, and she had spent too many years managing her own expectations to take that kind of risk casually. She sealed the letter and asked Mrs. Pratt's son to post it. Nathan set the new names on the table and sat down. He looked like a man who had been thinking while he walked. 3 more, he said. She looked at the names. That makes 21. That Thayer knows about. He folded his hands on the table. There's a county in the Eastern Territory, Dawson County, where the records clerk told me they had a series of similar complaints filed 2 years ago that never went anywhere because the complainants couldn't identify the originating entity. Vane's shell companies were different there. Different names. But the same mechanism, she said. The same clause, he said. The clerk recognized it when I described it. She looked at the window. Outside, Helena was going about its second day of not knowing about the hearing on Lawrence Street, because the press coverage had not yet made it to most people, and wouldn't for another week at least. That was the strange thing about a proceeding like this. It felt enormous from the inside and invisible from the outside, until suddenly it wasn't. How many do you think there are altogether? She asked. I don't know, Nathan said, more than we found. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, running numbers she didn't have against the rough shape of the scheme she understood very well by now. If we assume Vane's operation has been running for 6 years, and they were averaging 3 to 4 agreements per county per year in 10 counties. That's 120 agreements, Nathan said. He had been running the same calculation, give or take. She looked at him. Some would have been identified and challenged already. Some of those ranchers may have walked away without understanding why their water situation changed. Some may have sold and left. She paused, but that's the scale of it. Nathan was looking at her. There was something in his expression she had noticed more in the past 2 days, since the hearing, since the restaurant on Rodney Street, since the shift in the air between them that neither of them had yet named. He looked at her the way you look at something you are still discovering the edges of. You've been thinking about this since before the hearing, he said. Since before I came to your ranch, she said honestly. I've been thinking about this since Nebraska. She picked up his list of 3 names and looked at it. I want to do something about it. Beyond this case. Beyond Thayer's filing. Tell me, he said. She told him about the legal fund that afternoon, walking the streets of Helena, because neither of them was built for sitting still when something needed thinking through. It was cold enough for breath to show, and she had borrowed a heavier coat from Mrs. Pratt, which was slightly too short in the sleeves, but warm enough. The idea was not fully formed, and she did not pretend it was. What she knew was this. The reason Vane's scheme had worked as long as it had was not because ranchers were stupid. It was because they had no access to someone who could read a contract and tell them in plain language what it said before they signed it. Lawyers existed, but lawyers cost money that working homesteaders and small ranchers rarely had. Land agents knew this. They counted on it. What if there was a fund, not charity? She was specific about this. Not charity that paid for legal review of contracts for landholders who couldn't otherwise afford it. Not after the fraud had happened, not to fight it retroactively, but before. Review first, sign after. The kind of thing that should exist through the legal system and largely didn't. She had restitution money coming, potentially, from the Nebraska case if Thayer's contact could get it moving. She didn't know how much. It wouldn't be a fortune, but it would be a start. Nathan listened to all of it. They walked 2 full blocks in silence after she finished before he said anything. You'd need a lawyer to run it, he said, or a lawyer to advise it. Thayer might know someone in Helena who could manage the intake process. And you'd need to let people know it existed, he said. Ranchers in Dawson County and Powder River and everywhere else Vane's operation reached, they need to know there's somewhere to bring a contract before they sign. That's the harder part, she admitted, not necessarily. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were in front of a dry goods store, the window displaying bolts of fabric and tin goods, arranged with the optimism of a display that had never had a particularly large audience. The territorial press covered yesterday's hearing. If Thayer can get the story into the right papers, not just the hearing outcome, but the broader scheme, the mechanism every rancher in the territory who's been approached by someone with a water agreement is going to start looking at that document differently. She looked at him. You'd be willing to talk to the press about it, not me specifically, but the case, the facts. He paused. And you, I'm not a figure people are going to pay attention to. You held that courtroom for 14 minutes, he said. You're exactly a figure people are going to pay attention to. He said it without emphasis, the way he said things that were simply true. People read stories about schemes because schemes are frightening. They read about the people who stopped them because that's the part they need to believe is possible. She looked away down the street. A woman passed with 2 children, the children loud and specific about their grievances with each other, in the way of children everywhere. The ordinary street doing its ordinary business. She was not accustomed to being told she was worth paying attention to by someone who wasn't immediately asking her for something. It sat in her chest in a way she didn't know exactly what to do with. We should talk to Thayer, she said. We should, he said. And they turned and walked back toward Lawrence Street. Thayer's response to the legal fund idea was characteristic. He listened to all of it without interrupting, asked 4 specific questions, said nothing for 30 seconds, and then said, I know a woman in Helena, Helen Marsh. She ran legal aid through the Methodist circuit for 8 years before the circuit funding dried up. She understands how to operate a small legal resource office on almost nothing. He paused. She's been looking for a reason to start again. Evelyn looked at him. You've thought about something like this before, she said. I have cases going back 20 years that I couldn't help because the people who needed help couldn't pay for it, Thayer said simply. The thought has occurred to me periodically. Would you be willing to advise it? Officially. Your name attached. He looked at her over his glasses. My name attached to what exactly? We don't have a fund yet. We don't have an office. We have an idea and a potential restitution payment from Nebraska that may or may not materialize. We have the outcome of yesterday's hearing, Evelyn said. We have the press coverage. We have your name already on the filing that produced the outcome. And we have Nathan Cole. She looked at Nathan. A rancher of his standing vouching for the initiative would carry weight. Nathan was looking at her with that same expression discovering edges. Thayer took his glasses off and cleaned them, which was his version of considering something seriously. Let me speak to Ellen Marsh, he said. If she's willing to manage the intake structure, I'll advise. And I'll speak to the territorial bar about a formal charter. He put his glasses back on. We'll need a name for it. Not something grandiose. Something specific. The Silver Creek Legal Fund, Nathan said. Plain, Thayer said. That's the point, Nathan said. Thayer looked at him. Then he wrote it down. They rode back to Ridgeline on Friday. The 3 additional rancher names went with them, and Thayer's promised to notify all 21 families within the week, and the rough outline of a conversation with Ellen Marsh that Thayer had summarized in a one-page handwritten note that Evelyn folded into her coat pocket with the same care she'd have given something considerably more formal. The ride home was quieter than the ride out. Not uncomfortable quiet, the other kind. The kind that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Albert Mercer rode with them as far as his ranch turnoff. Before he split away, he pulled his horse level with Evelyn's and said, without preamble, "My wife wants you to know she'll make the trip out to the coal ranch to thank you properly when the weather holds." "She doesn't need to do that," Evelyn said. "I know she doesn't need to," Mercer said. "She wants to." He paused. "And I want you to know what you said in there. About it not being our fault for trusting a system that was run against us. I've been a rancher for 22 years. I'm not a stupid man. But I signed that document and I've been ashamed about it for 2 years." He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided something has to be said, so it might as well be said plainly. "You helped me let go of that shame. I'm grateful." Evelyn looked at him. She didn't know what to say, which was not a familiar condition. So she said the honest thing. "Your testimony helped 5 other families today." "That's not nothing." He nodded. Then he turned his horse and rode south, and they watched him go until the road bent and he disappeared. Pete Dunbar met them at the ranch gate. He had the look of a man who had run things competently in someone else's absence and wanted it noted without having to say so, which was such a characteristic Pete expression that Nathan and Evelyn exchanged a glance without meaning to. "Anything we need to know?" Nathan asked. "East fence is repaired. Bunkhouse roof stopped the leak I told you about in September. And the Reardon brothers asked about wintering their horses in our north paddock. I told them I'd let them know." Pete's gaze moved to Evelyn briefly. "Also, letter came for you. Nebraska postmark." He said it without emphasis, but Pete noticed everything, and the fact that he mentioned it at all rather than simply leaving it on the kitchen table meant he had registered its significance. Evelyn swung down from her horse. "Thank you," she said. She didn't open it until she was inside in the kitchen, with the door closed. Nathan came in while she was reading it and saw her face and stopped. "What is it?" he said. She read to the end of the page. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. "It's from the York County Recorder's Office," she said. "Not a response to my letter. This one was already in transit before I sent it. It's about the county dispute record from 1879. When Thayer submitted it as evidence in the Helena filing, copies went to the Territorial Attorneys Network." She paused. "The York County Recorder had been sitting on a petition from the family that bought our homestead. They identified the fraudulent clause in the title 5 years ago and filed a petition to void the original transfer. The petition has been stalled for lack of corroborating evidence from other jurisdictions." She looked up. Thayer's filing was the corroborating evidence. Nathan stood very still. "The recorder is writing to inform me that the petition has been reopened and referred to a Nebraska circuit judge," she said. "If the judge grants it, the fraudulent transfer is void. Which means—" She stopped, steadied herself. "Which means the chain of title reverts to the last legitimate holder." "Your father's estate," Nathan said. "What's left of it?" She pressed her lips together. "He died in 1881. In a boarding house in Omaha, he had nothing left." She said it factually, not sentimentally. The sentimentality was somewhere beneath it, but she had learned to keep it there. "I'm his heir. I would be the claimant." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove was doing its small work. Outside, Pete was saying something to one of the hands in the yard, his voice carrying through the window. The ordinary sound of the ranch going on. "Is the land still the original parcel?" Nathan asked. "I don't know," she said. "The family that bought it may have altered it. There's a structure on it. The record mentions a structure." She looked at the letter again. "It might be worth almost nothing. The recorder doesn't give any figure." A pause. "It might not be voided at all. This is a reopened petition. That's not a decision." "But it's moving," Nathan said. "It's moving," she said. She sat down at the kitchen table, which was the table she had scrubbed on her first afternoon at this ranch, where she had sat with Thayer and walked him through what she recognized in the vain document, where she had told Nathan 12 years of work history while he wrote on a folded piece of paper. She was not going to cry. She was aware of the possibility, and she was choosing not to, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because she was tired, and if she started, she wasn't certain where it would end. Nathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't say anything. He was simply there the way he had been there in the Helena courthouse corridor, in the way that a present and solid thing is there. After a moment, she said, "I have been carrying that county record for 12 years. "I know," he said. "I didn't know what I was carrying it toward. I just couldn't put it down." "No," he said. "Some things you carry until they're done." She looked at him. His face in the kitchen light was not a handsome face in any conventional arrangement of the word, but it was a truthful face. a face that showed what it meant and meant what it showed, which she had come to understand was considerably rarer than handsome. The Nebraska restitution, if it comes through, goes to the fund, she said. The Silver Creek Legal Fund, whatever it amounts to. He looked at her steadily. That's your family's land. It's already been someone else's land for 12 years, she said. If I get money for it, I know what it needs to do. She held his gaze. My father spent 9 years building a homestead for people who came after him to live on. I'd rather spend that restitution so someone else's father doesn't lose 9 years to a man like Vane. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. She couldn't always tell what his silences meant. This one had a quality she hadn't encountered before in him, something heavier and more internal. He would have been glad of that, Nathan said finally. Your father, she looked down at the table. Maybe, she said. He was a proud man. He might have wanted me to keep it. A pause. But I think he also understood that some kinds of pride cost more than they're worth. The letter from Margaret Whitlock arrived the following week. Evelyn didn't know about it until Nathan brought it to the kitchen table himself and set it in front of her, which was its own kind of statement. He sat down across from her with the same directness he brought to everything. I owe you an explanation of something, he said. She looked at the envelope. She could read the return address, Denver. She had known, in the way she knew most things she hadn't been told by inference and observation, that there had been a woman. The letter he had sent before the hearing. Pete's careful non-comments. The way the second bedroom upstairs had the quality of a room that had been mentally assigned to a future that no longer existed. You don't owe me an explanation, she said. Maybe not, but I want to give you one anyway. He looked at the envelope. 6 months ago, I arranged to bring a woman out from Denver to marry. I wrote to end the arrangement before we left for Helena. Her letter is, he paused. She understands. She's not unkind about it. She's a sensible woman, and I think she's probably relieved, honestly, though she's too polite to say so. Evelyn looked at him. Why are you telling me this? He met her eyes. Because I don't want there to be things between us that you don't know, he said. She looked at the letter for a moment, then at him. What is there between us, she asked. She said it directly. Not archly, she genuinely wanted to know how he would say it. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that he was quiet when he was finding the right words rather than the easy ones. I don't know what to call it yet, he said. But I know it's real, and I know I don't want to make a mess of it by assuming things or moving faster than I should. He looked at her steadily. I know you've worked for wages your whole life, and that you've been in situations where the power between you and the person paying those wages was not equal. I don't want this to be one of those situations. She looked at him for a long moment. He was, she thought, one of the most careful people she had met when it came to things that actually mattered. Careless about his own comfort, careless about appearances, careless about what people thought of his choices, but very careful about the people his choices affected. It's not one of those situations, she said. Good, he said. Then I'd like to keep talking to you, as whatever this is, at whatever pace this needs. That's an unusually undemanding proposal, she said. It's the only honest one I had, he said. October moved toward November, and the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of pre-winter work, the serious work, the work that determined how hard the cold season would be. Hay stores assessed and found adequate. Cattle moved to the lower pastures where the feed held longer. The smokehouse stocked. The bunkhouse weatherproofed against what was coming. Evelyn ran the household through it with the same methodical competence she had brought to it from the beginning, but something had shifted. Not in the work itself, the work was the same. In the relationship between the work and the place. She had started to think of the kitchen as hers. Not owned exactly. More like inhabited. The way you inhabit a place when you've put enough of yourself into it, that it begins to hold the shape of you. She had not allowed herself to think that way about anywhere since Nebraska. She noticed it happening, and let it happen, which was its own kind of decision. Thayer sent word that Ellen Marsh had agreed to manage the Silver Creek Legal Fund intake process. The territorial bar had approved a provisional charter. The fund had as yet no money. The Nebraska restitution was still in process, moving through the circuit court at the speed of institutions, but Thayer had written to 4 established Helena attorneys asking for small inaugural contributions, and 3 had responded positively. That's enough to start, Evelyn told Nathan when she read him the letter at dinner. It's enough to exist, he said. Starting takes cases. Thayer already has 2 families from the Dawson County list who want their contracts reviewed. He looked at her. You've already spoken to him about cases. I wrote to him last week. She set the letter on the table. While you were out with Pete looking at the north fence. Nathan almost smiled. You couldn't wait. The families couldn't wait, she said. There's a difference. He did smile then fully, which was still an infrequent enough occurrence that it changed the room slightly when it happened. There's not much difference, he said, when it comes to you. She chose not to argue with that because he wasn't entirely wrong. Vane's criminal proceeding formally opened in November. Thayer sent a summary of the charges: fraud, conspiracy to defraud territorial landholders, falsification of official documents, and due to the threatening letter intimidation of a witness in a territorial proceeding. Crow faced additional charges from the Billings warrant. The territorial attorney's office had taken the case with unusual speed, which Thayer attributed, partly to the press coverage. Two Helena papers had run substantial pieces on the hearing outcome, and the Ridgeline Gazette had run a front-page story that managed to be factually accurate while also being the kind of story that made a territory's legal establishment very aware of being watched. Vane entered a plea of not guilty. Crow, facing charges from two jurisdictions, began talking to the territorial attorney's investigators within a week of his arrest. This was the thing Vane had not anticipated, that Crow, who had been the operation's frontman, who had ridden onto the coal ranch and looked through the kitchen window at Evelyn Bennett and decided she was expendable, would decide within a month of custody that his own skin was worth more than Vane's silence. Crow talked at length. He talked about the shell company structure, the surveyor, who had amended the 1,874 record in exchange for a payment he had spent before he retired, the specific mechanism by which target ranches were selected. He named 17 additional families beyond Thayer's original 21, who had been defrauded through variations of the same scheme in different counties under different company names. 38 families altogether. When Thayer sent that number to Evelyn, she sat with it for a long time before she said anything to anyone. 38. Working ranches and homesteads. People who had signed papers they thought were routine, and had watched their water situations change and their operating margins tighten, and had generally assumed it was weather or bad luck or their own failures. Some of them had left. Some were still on their land, diminished, not knowing why things had never been quite right since the year they signed. She was in the garden when Nathan found her there, pulling the last of the frostbitten turnip greens that hadn't made it before the freeze. Not a productive task at this point. More the kind of thing you did when your hands needed something to do. Thayer's letter, he said. 38, she said. He crouched down beside where she was working and picked up a frost-blackened turnip leaf and turned it in his hands. It was cold in the garden. Their breath made small clouds. The fund, he said. The fund will need to be bigger than I thought, she said. If we're going to help all 38 pursue restitution, I want to contribute, he said. She looked at him. To the fund, he said directly. A significant contribution. Not through Thayer's solicitations directly, my name attached. He looked at the turnip leaf. I've built 1,500 acres. I have money I reinvest into land and cattle every year, because there was never any other purpose for it. I think this is a purpose. She looked at him for a long moment. He was crouched down in a frost-killed garden being entirely serious about giving money to a legal fund for strangers, and it struck her not for the first time, but more fully than before what kind of man he actually was beneath the size and the silence and the reputation. It's your money, she said. It is, he said, and I'd like to spend some of it on this, if you'll let the fund accept it. You don't need my permission, she said. No, he said, but I'd like your agreement, because this matters to you, and I don't want to be the person who takes it over by throwing money at it without asking. She looked at him, the cold garden, the frost-cleared sky, the enormous, careful man crouched in the dirt of a Montana November, being deliberately specific about the kind of respect he was offering. Yes, she said, the fund will accept it, he nodded. He set down the turnip leaf and stood up and offered her his hand to stand, which she took, and he was warm even in the cold, which was the kind of detail that stayed with you. The Nebraska Circuit Court issued its ruling the first week of December. The fraudulent transfer of the Bennett homestead was voided. The chain of title reverted to the Bennett estate. The land itself had been subdivided over the years, and the current occupants were legitimate purchasers who had bought in good faith from the entity that had fraudulently acquired it. They were not at fault and would not be displaced. But the estate was entitled to restitution for the value of the land at the time of the fraudulent transfer, adjusted for 12 years of productive use. The restitution figure was $430. Evelyn read the ruling at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning. Then she set it down and went and stood at the kitchen window for a while. $430 was not a fortune. It was the value the court had assigned to 9 years of her father's life and 12 years of her own carrying of it. It was simultaneously not enough, and more than she had expected, which was the particular way that justice worked when it finally arrived, real but imperfect, valuable but incomplete. She put it in the Silver Creek Legal Fund. Not all at once, the money took 3 weeks to clear through the Nebraska court's process and the banking arrangements Thayer set up. But when it came through, she signed the transfer herself and sent it to Ellen Marsh in Helena, who wrote back a brief, careful letter that said, among other things, the Dawson County family whose contract we reviewed last month kept their water rights. I thought you'd want to know. She kept that letter. Nathan asked her to come with him to the south pasture in the third week of December, which was an unusual request for no apparent reason, and which she therefore correctly identified as a request that had a reason she hadn't been told yet. She went. The south pasture was the edge of his land where the property ran up to a low ridge, and you could see west toward the mountains and north toward the creek corridor, and in winter the whole landscape was stark and specific, no leaves to soften edges, no grass to blur distances, just land showing its actual shape. He had always thought it was the most honest view on the ranch. He had thought a great deal about how to do this. He was not a man who was good at the kinds of speeches people gave at important moments. He had written it out once and then burned it, because the written version sounded like he was trying to impress someone rather than say a true thing. So he said the true thing. "I've been building this ranch for 11 years, he said, "and for most of that time I've been building it the way you build something when you don't know what it's for. Like the point was the building." He looked at her. "I know what it's for now." Evelyn looked back at him. The wind was coming off the north. She had her borrowed coat on, the one that was slightly too short in the sleeves, because she had not yet bought herself a new one, and he had not pushed her to, because there were always things she considered more urgent. "Evelyn," he said, "I'd like to marry you. Not because the ranch needs you, although it does, and I won't pretend otherwise, but because I can't imagine going through whatever comes next without you beside me. And because you're the first person in 11 years who's made this place feel like somewhere worth staying." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the woman who had walked up to this ranch gate 11 weeks ago with a canvas bag and $11, and a pair of boots held together with wire. That woman had not been expecting this. That woman had been expecting what she always got: decent work, fair wages, and then eventually somewhere else. She thought about what she had told Clara Sutherland in the Sutherland ranch yard. "I walked away once. I'm not walking away again." She looked at Nathan Cole, the enormous, difficult, careful, specific man who had said all right when she needed to be believed, and had stood in the Helena courthouse corridor so she didn't have to stand alone. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that said he had been less certain of the answer than he'd appeared. "Good," he said. She almost laughed. "That's all? Good? I've got more," he said, but I was too nervous to plan past the yes. She did laugh then, a real laugh, the kind she didn't perform for anyone, the kind that happened when something was actually funny. He looked briefly startled by it, and then he laughed too, which was a sound she realized she had not heard from him before, and which was, she decided immediately, something she intended to hear considerably more of. They stood in the south pasture in the December cold while the wind moved across the land, and the mountains sat patient and enormous to the west, and the ranch stretched around them in every direction, imperfect, well-built, alive in the way that things are alive when someone is finally paying proper attention to them. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. They didn't need to. They married on a Saturday in January, not a large ceremony. Neither of them wanted large Nathan, because he had never been comfortable with the performative side of things, and Evelyn because she had learned long ago that the moments that actually mattered in a life were rarely the ones with the most witnesses. They married in the front room of the Cole Ranch, which Evelyn had spent 3 days making fit for the occasion, without making it into something it wasn't: a fire laid properly. The furniture moved to make space. A few cut pine boughs from the ridge because it was January, and there was nothing else green. Mrs. Pratt came down from Helena, which no one had expected. Clara Sutherland came with her husband, who was well enough by then to make the trip. Albert Mercer came with his wife, a small woman named Ruth, who had baked a cake and carried it 70 miles in a wagon box without letting it fall, which was either devotion or stubbornness, and possibly both. Thayer was there. He stood near the back wall with his brown suit and his careful face, and the expression of a man who was satisfied without being sentimental about it. Pete Dunbar stood up for Nathan, which he did with the same economy he brought to everything he was present. He was serious, and when the moment called for some from him, he said, "About time," which was both accurate and the most Pete Dunbar thing that could have been said. The woman who managed the Ridgeline post office, Mrs. Cara, came because she had heard about the hearing and had opinions about Silas Vane that she had been wanting to express to someone connected to his downfall, and a wedding seemed like a reasonable occasion for it. She sat in the front row and cried, which surprised everyone, including herself. Evelyn wore a dress she had made herself from fabric. She had bought in Ridgeline dark blue wool, plain cut, nothing that would have impressed anyone who expected impression. She had spent 2 evenings on it by lamplight, and it fit her properly, which was more than she could say for most of what she owned, and that was enough. Nathan, for his part, had found a suit that actually accommodated his shoulders, which was an achievement that had required 3 trips to the Ridgeline dry goods and a significant amount of creative alteration by the tailor, who had charged accordingly. They stood in front of a justice of the peace named Alderman Cross. who was 68 and had been marrying people in this territory for 22 years, and had the efficient tenderness of someone who understood the ceremony was not the point, but that the ceremony still mattered. When Cross asked Nathan if he would take this woman, Nathan looked at Evelyn and said, yes, in the same tone he'd said all right that first afternoon in the kitchen, certain unhurried, meaning it completely. When Cross asked Evelyn, she said, I will, and meant it in all the ways that a woman who has learned not to trust easy things means something she has decided to trust. Cross pronounced them married, Mrs. Kara cried harder. Pete said nothing, which was its own form of approval. Evelyn thought, briefly and without drama, about a canvas bag with $11 in it and a pair of boots held together with wire. She thought about her father's face and the Nebraska homestead and the 30 days' notice and the 12 years after. She did not think about these things with sadness exactly, but with the particular kind of clarity that comes when you understand how each thing led to the next, not because it was supposed to, not because the universe was arranging itself for her benefit, but simply because that was how living worked. You carried what you carried until it became something else. Then Ruth Mercer cut the cake, and the moment was over, and the room was warm and full of people she was glad to know, and that was its own kind of complete. Silas Vane's trial opened in February. Crow had already entered a guilty plea on reduced charges in exchange for his testimony, which meant the territorial attorney's case against Vane was built on the testimony of Vane's own former partner, supplemented by Thayer's documentation, Gill's survey analysis, and the records of 38 defrauded families. Beaumont Sear defended with his considerable skill, but the thing about a case built on documents is that documents don't adjust their testimony under cross-examination. Evelyn traveled to Helena for 2 days of the trial to provide supplementary testimony on the Nebraska comparison, the county record she had kept for 12 years. Now formally entered into evidence in a second proceeding. She had not been required to go. Thayer had told her the case was strong enough without her. She went because she needed to see it through to its face, not just its outcome. Nathan went with her. They sat in the same courthouse on Lawrence Street, where the hearing had been held 4 months before, and this time the room was fuller. The press had covered the fraud story extensively through the winter, and the trial had drawn attention from people who had never heard of Silver Creek, or the coal ranch, or Evelyn Bennett. The story had become the kind of story that a territory pays attention to when it's trying to understand itself, when it's trying to figure out what kind of place it's becoming and whether the systems it has built can actually be trusted. Vane sat at his table with the same contained composure he had worn at the hearing. But it was thinner now, Evelyn could see that. 4 months of criminal proceedings had cost him something, not just money, not just the operation, but the particular certainty of a man who had spent years moving through the world without consequence. That certainty was damaged, and he knew it, and the knowing showed just barely in the set of his shoulders. When Evelyn testified, she was calmer than she had been in October. The shape of the courtroom was familiar now, and Foss was not presiding. This was a trial judge named Hargrove, who was younger and less laconic, but the experience of being in that chair, of being looked at by a room full of people while you say things that matter, was no longer entirely foreign. She identified the Nebraska clause. She identified the Vane clause. She explained the structural comparison in the same precise, unperformed language she had used before. Sear's cross-examination was more aggressive. This time he had nothing left to lose by that point, and he tried harder. But she had been through it once, and she knew his moves, and she answered each question with the same flat accuracy until he had nothing left to try. When she stepped down, Nathan was in the gallery, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, steadily, like she was a fact he was still discovering the dimensions of. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Vane was convicted on 9 counts of fraud, 3 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of witness intimidation. The sentence was 14 years. Thayer sent a note to the ranch the following morning that said simply, 14 years. Gill was right. The survey amendment was the anchor. W.T. Nathan read it and passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it and folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept the letters that mattered. It was getting to be a full drawer. Spring came to the coal ranch the way spring came to Montana, not gently but decisively. The cold breaking over a few days in March, and the land emerging from snow with the slightly dazed quality of something that has been through a hard thing and is assessing the damage. There was mud, and there was the particular chaos of calving season, and there was the south fence which had not survived the winter as well as Pete had hoped, and there was the garden, which Evelyn stood at the edge of in early April and looked at with the eyes of someone making a plan. She had expanded it in the fall, adding a second plot south of the original. Now she was thinking about a third. "You're going to turn the whole south yard into a garden," Nathan said from behind her. "Not the whole yard," she said. "I need to leave room for the smokehouse approach." "That's very generous of you." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning in the kitchen doorway with coffee, watching her with that specific expression she had come to know well over the winter, a kind of patient, particular attention, like she was the most interesting thing in his field of view, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She had gotten better at receiving it. Not entirely comfortable, she wasn't sure she'd ever be entirely comfortable with being looked at like that, but better. She no longer looked away reflexively. She was working on the capacity to simply accept that this was how he looked at her, because that was what he felt, and because he was not a man who performed feelings he didn't have. The Dawson County family, she said, turning back to the garden. Ellen Marsh wrote yesterday. The circuit court voided their agreement. Water rights restored. I know, he said. You told me at breakfast. I'm telling you again. You tell me every good outcome twice, he said. Once when it happens, and once when you've processed it. She considered this. Is that irritating? No, he said. It's how I know when something's actually landed for you. She thought about that for a moment, about being known, that specifically about the particular and slightly vertiginous experience of living with someone who paid close enough attention to notice the difference between when you'd heard something and when you'd absorbed it. It had been 3 months since the wedding. She was still getting used to the dimension of it, not the fact of it, which she had accepted fully and without reservation, but the daily texture. The ordinary intimacy of sharing meals and mornings, of his boots by the door alongside hers, of a house that had two people's habits woven into it rather than one person's. The ranch had changed. Not in any dramatic way. The land was the same land, the cattle the same cattle, the daily work the same work. But there was warmth in it, now that there hadn't been before. Not the warmth she had put into it deliberately in those first weeks. The practical warmth of fires laid and kitchens scrubbed and rugs found in trunks. Something that grew between two people who were paying attention to each other in a house that was big enough for both of them. She noticed it in the hands, too. They ate differently, not because the food had changed, though the food remained very good, but because a table where people actually talked was a different table than one where men ate quickly to get back to work. It had become a place where the day's events got discussed, where problems got raised before they became crises, where Pete Dunbar occasionally said something so dry and specific that the whole table went quiet for a moment before laughing. Pete had, in his way, decided he approved of Evelyn. He demonstrated this by talking to her the same way he talked to Nathan, which was the highest compliment in his register. In May, Vane's lawyers filed an appeal. Thayer sent word immediately, which Evelyn appreciated. He did not try to soften it or delay it. The appeal was based on a procedural argument about the admissibility of the 1874 survey amendment as evidence, a technical claim that the chain of custody for the document had been insufficiently documented at trial. It was, Thayer wrote, not a strong appeal, but it was a real one and it needed to be answered. Nathan read the letter and put it down on the table with more force than he'd intended. He's not going to walk, Evelyn said. She had read it already. I know, he said, but it's a procedural argument. Thayer will answer it. Gill documented the chain of custody meticulously. We both know that, I know it, he said. I'm still angry. You're allowed to be angry, she said. She sat down across from him. I'm angry too. I've been angry since I was 17 years old. But anger isn't the same as lost. He looked at her. You're very good at keeping those separate. I've had more practice than you, she said. It wasn't unkind, it was simply true. Men like you, men who have built something real, who have always had the ground under them when something threatens it, you feel it as an emergency, because you haven't spent your whole life learning that the ground can go. I have, she looked at the letter, so I know how to keep moving when it shifts. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. Somewhere across the yard, Pete was talking to one of the hands about the south fence repair. That's not a small thing, Nathan said finally. What you're describing, living that way. No, she said, but it taught me things I needed to know. She looked at him steadily, including how to read a contract clause at a kitchen table that saved your ranch. He almost smiled, including that. Thayer filed the appeal response in June. The appellate review took 8 weeks. In August, the appeal was denied. Vane's conviction stood, the 14 years stood. By the following autumn, the Silver Creek Legal Fund had reviewed 41 contracts. Of those, 27 had contained problematic language, some fraudulent in the Vane pattern, some simply unfavorable in ways the signatories hadn't understood, some legitimately sound but confusingly written, which was its own problem worth solving. Ellen Marsh had hired a part-time clerk. Thayer had brought in a second attorney on a consulting basis, a young woman named Harris who had trained in Chicago and come west looking for work that mattered, which the fund provided. The territory's major paper ran a long piece on the fund in September. It was the kind of piece that generated letters to the editor, some supportive, some from legal interests, who felt the fund created unnecessary obstacles to legitimate commerce. Evelyn read the critical letters carefully and wrote responses to two of them that Thayer reviewed and said were accurate, and she sent them and they were published, and she did not read them again because she knew what was in them and didn't need to revisit her own arguments. Nathan read everything she wrote. He said nothing about most of it except occasionally, "That's right," at a specific sentence which she had come to understand was his highest form of editorial praise. When a reporter from the Helena paper asked to interview Evelyn about the fund, she agreed. She sat with the reporter, a young man, serious and slightly nervous at the kitchen table with coffee, and answered his questions without performing anything. She told him what the fund did and why. She told him about the mechanism of contract fraud and how it targeted people who trusted legal instruments they didn't have the resources to understand. She told him about her father's homestead briefly without sentimentality. She told him that the fund was not about charity. That word kept appearing in the reporter's questions, and she kept correcting it, but about access. The law existed. The protection existed. What had not existed for too many people was access to someone who could stand between them and the document before they signed it. The piece ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. Ellen Marsh wrote that the fund received 19 inquiry letters in the 2 weeks following publication. The clerk was working overtime. It was Nathan who noticed the change in Evelyn first, which was in itself a measure of how much had shifted between them. They were in the south pasture one evening in October, the same pasture where he had proposed, the ridge behind them, going gold in the low sun, and she was quieter than usual in a way that was different from her ordinary quiet. He had learned the varieties of her silence the way you learn weather signs, the silence of focused thinking, the silence of processing, the silence of not wanting to say something yet, and this one, which was new. "What is it?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at the land. "I've been thinking about the fund," she said, "about where it needs to go." "All right. Ellen can manage the intake. Harris can manage the legal review. What it doesn't have is someone who can travel. Someone who goes to the counties where the families are, instead of waiting for the families to find us." She paused. "The people who need this most are the ones least likely to know it exists, even with the press coverage. They're on homesteads 2 days' ride from a post office. They got a document from someone who seemed official and they signed it because that's what you do when an official-seeming person tells you it's routine. You want to do the traveling," he said. She looked at him. It wasn't a question and she didn't treat it as one. "I want to do part of it, not all the ranch needs. The ranch has Pete," Nathan said, "and me. And it's in better shape than it's ever been, because you've been running the household end of it like a general." He looked at her. "How often? Quarterly, maybe. A week or two each time. Into the adjacent counties and further if the cases warrant." He thought about it. She watched him think the real kind, not the kind that was really just waiting to say what he'd already decided. "I want to come when I can," he said, "not every time." But sometimes he met her eyes. "Not because you need me there. Because I'd like to see what you do when you sit across a table from a family that doesn't know yet that what happened to them has a name." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the pasture. The ridge held its gold. "All right," she said. He almost smiled at that. The word returning. Full circle, the word she had said to him on the first afternoon in the kitchen. The word that had meant, "I'm taking you seriously, and I'm moving forward." He had not forgotten that she'd said it first. The first trip out was in November, to Dawson County, where Crow's testimony had identified 11 families who had signed agreements under the Eastern Territory Shell Company. Evelyn went with Harris, who turned out to be an excellent traveling companion, efficient, unsentimental, and possessed of a legal mind that could explain a fraudulent clause in language a tired rancher could understand at the end of a workday. They took 5 days. They visited 8 homesteads. 2 of the families had already left their land sold, their whereabouts unknown, their cases now going into a different kind of file, the kind that was harder to resolve but worth trying. 6 families were there, working their land, living with the diminishment that years of compromised water rights had imposed on their operations without them ever fully understanding why. Evelyn sat in 6 kitchens over 5 days and explained the same mechanism 6 times. She did not get tired of explaining it. What she got each time was the particular expression on a person's face when they understand for the first time that what happened to them was not bad luck, or their own failing, that there is a name for it, a documented pattern, a legal argument that says this was done to you and it was wrong and it can be addressed. She had seen that expression first on Albert Mercer's face in his kitchen, when Nathan had explained the hearing. She had never gotten tired of it. On the last evening at the final homestead, a family named Birch, a man and his 2 grown sons who had been running cattle on Dawson County land. For 15 years, the older son, maybe 25, asked her, "How did you know? The first time, how did you know what you were looking at?" She thought about it for a moment. She could have given him the obvious answer, her father's homestead, The Nebraska clause. 12 years of carrying the county record. That was true, but it wasn't the whole of it. I read everything, she said. Every document, every notice, everything that came through that had words on it. Not because I was expecting fraud. Just because reading carefully is the only way to actually know what something says rather than what someone tells you it says. She looked at him. Your father read that contract. He just trusted the man presenting it to tell him what the important parts were. The important parts were the ones the man didn't mention. The young man nodded slowly. So it's about trusting the words more than the person holding them. It's about understanding that a document is a separate thing from the person presenting it, she said. The document says what it says regardless of how trustworthy the person handing it to you seems. He thought about that. Then is that something you can teach? She looked at him. He was serious, a rancher's son in his father's kitchen in Dawson County, asking a real question. Yes, she said. That is absolutely something that can be taught. She wrote it down that evening in the small notebook she had started keeping for fun notes. Document literacy, teach it, not just remediate it. Start with the schools if possible, the next generation. She showed it to Harris the next morning on the road back. Harris read it and said, that's a 3-year project minimum. I know, Evelyn said. The fund doesn't have the resources for it yet. Not yet, Evelyn said. Harris looked at her. She had come to understand over the 5 days how Evelyn Bennett thought, which was always 2 or 3 stages ahead of the current problem, always with the next problem already identified. Not because she was restless, but because she had spent 12 years watching what happened when people weren't prepared in time. You're going to build it until it does, Harris said. Yes, Evelyn said simply. That's what I'm going to do. The winter that followed was the kind of winter that tests things: heavy snow, sustained cold, 2 weeks in January, where the temperature dropped far enough that working cattle became a daily emergency rather than a routine. Pete managed the ranch operations with his characteristic unflappable competence, and Nathan worked alongside his hands the way he always had. The enormous figure in the heavy coat that could be seen from halfway across any pasture, present and physical and moving. Evelyn ran the household through it. She also ran from the kitchen table a correspondence that had grown considerable letters to and from Thayer, from Ellen Marsh, from Harris, from 4 of the 6 Dawson County families working through their restitution claims, from a circuit court clerk in Powder River County who had seen the Hellenton press piece and had questions about the fund's charter structure. She answered every letter. Some of them took 3 drafts. Nathan watched her writing by lamplight some evenings and thought about what the house had been when she arrived: the cold rooms, the abandoned kitchen, the shelf of unread books. He had built the house to have. It had taken Evelyn coming through the door for him to understand that a house is not a possession. It is a practice. You have to practice living in it every day or it goes hollow. He had been hollow for a long time without knowing what hollowness felt like from the inside. He knew now, by contrast. One evening in February, near the anniversary of the hearing, he sat down across from her while she was writing and waited for her to finish the paragraph. She looked up. What? She said. I've been thinking about something, he said. She set her pen down. This was the signal pen down, full attention. She gave it unsparingly when something mattered. When I built this ranch, he said, I thought strength was the point of it. Physical strength, financial strength, land and cattle and fences that held. Things that couldn't be argued with. He looked at his hands on the table, the large, scarred, capable hands of a man who had worked 1,500 acres with them. I was building evidence. Evidence that I was worth taking seriously. That I had done enough. She looked at him. I never thought about what I was building it for, he said. And then you sat at this table and read a document I should have read more carefully, and everything started moving. And now, he looked at her. Now I think the strongest thing I've ever done is say all right to a woman I'd known for 10 minutes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, You were the first person in 12 years who believed me without making me prove it twice. He looked at her. That's not nothing, she said. For someone who's spent their whole life proving things. She picked up her pen. That's actually everything. He sat with that for a while, in the warm kitchen, in the house that was no longer hollow, while the winter worked at the walls and the lamp made its small circle of light, and his wife wrote letters that would eventually find their way into courtrooms and county offices and the kitchens of people who didn't, yet know that what had happened to them had a name. There is a thing that happens when 2 people who have both been carrying something for a long time finally set it down and it's in the same place. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. From the outside, it looks like an ordinary ranch in ordinary winter. Lamplight in the windows, smoke from the chimney, the sounds of cattle and horses and men doing the work that needs doing. Nothing that would make a stranger stop on the road and look. But inside, it was not ordinary. Inside, it was two people who had arrived at something through roads that had no reason to intersect, who had both been shaped by loss in ways that made them careful and precise and not easily fooled, and who had found in each other the particular relief of being known accurately. Not idealized, not managed, known. Evelyn had spent 12 years being underestimated by people who looked at her and saw only what she looked like. She had spent 12 years knowing more than people expected her to know, and being right more often than she was believed. And she had done it without becoming bitter, which was the harder achievement. She had carried a county record from Nebraska to Montana, and it had eventually mattered. She had walked 3 miles from a crossroads rather than sit beside a man who didn't deserve her proximity, and that walk had led to a kitchen table, and a contract, and everything after. Nathan had spent 11 years building something enormous that was missing the thing that makes an enormous thing worth having. He had been strong in every way that was visible and hollow in the way that mattered, and he had not known how to fix it because he had not understood what was wrong. He had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone who would walk into his house and see it clearly and not be intimidated by the size of either the man or the mistake. The ranch thrived that second year. The cattle came through winter better than expected. The garden in spring was larger than it had ever been, with Evelyn's third plot turned and planted, and by July, producing more than the household needed, which meant the surplus went to the bunkhouse, and the bunkhouse ate better than it ever had. Pete Dunbar, who had never in his adult life said anything was better than adequate, told Nathan one morning that the food situation had improved considerably, which Nathan repeated to Evelyn that evening, and she said, "I know. Pete told me himself." And Nathan looked at her and said, "He told you directly?" And she said, "Last Tuesday." He also asked if I knew how to make molasses cake, and Nathan said, "Pete Dunbar asked you for a recipe," and she said, "He did," and they looked at each other for a moment and both understood without saying it that Pete Dunbar asking for a recipe was the most complete form of acceptance he was capable of expressing. The Silver Creek Legal Fund chartered formally in the spring of the second year, with Thayer as legal advisor, Ellen Marsh as director, Harris as lead reviewing attorney, and Evelyn Cole listed as founding member and field liaison. The founding document was a 2-page charter with plain language and a clear purpose. Evelyn had written the first draft. Thayer had made 4 changes. She had accepted 3 of them and argued successfully against the 4th. When Vane's 17 additional families came forward, the ones Crow had identified in his testimony, the ones who had been defrauded under the Eastern Territory variations of the scheme, the fund took their cases. Not all at once, methodically, in the order that gave the strongest claims the clearest path. By the end of the second year, 11 of the 17 had successful restitution claims. 4 were still in process. 2 had land situations too complicated to resolve through restitution, and were negotiating compensation instead. It was not a clean outcome. Justice rarely was, but it was an outcome which was more than any of those families had when they started. There is something that the frontier teaches, if you're willing to learn it, that the comfortable places rarely do. It teaches you that nothing holds because it deserves to hold. Land doesn't stay yours because you worked it. Water doesn't flow where you need it because you're good. What you have, you keep by attention and by action, and sometimes by standing in front of a courtroom and saying, clearly, and without flinching, what you know to be true. It teaches you that the size of a person is not measured in the dimensions you can see. Nathan Cole was the largest man in any room he entered, and it had taken a woman carrying a canvas bag and $11 and 12 years of careful, angry, persistent knowing to show him that his greatest size was not the physical one. Evelyn Bennett was a woman who had spent 12 years being assessed by her appearance and found insufficient, and she had turned that assessment into fuel without letting it become poison, which is one of the hardest things a human being can do. They were not perfect people. That should be said plainly, because the story loses its truth if they become something cleaner in the telling than they actually were. Nathan was slow to speak and sometimes too certain, and occasionally wrong in the way that people who are usually right are occasionally and more damagingly wrong. Evelyn was impatient with process when she could see the outcome clearly, which made her a difficult person to work alongside when the outcome was less clear than she thought. They argued twice, seriously, in the first year, once about the pace of the fund's expansion, and once about a ranch decision she hadn't been consulted on. Both arguments were real and both required actual resolution rather than smoothing over. But the arguments were between 2 people who had agreed on the fundamental thing that the other person was worth the argument, worth the discomfort of disagreement, worth the work of being honest rather than simply being agreeable. That agreement, once made, turned out to be remarkably sturdy. The last thing Evelyn did before the first real snowfall of the second winter was finish the document literacy proposal she had started writing in the Dawson County kitchen. It was 12 pages. It outlined a program for teaching homesteaders and small ranchers how to read and evaluate land contracts before signing, through a combination of printed guides distributed through county offices and periodic workshops in the larger towns. It was ambitious and underfunded and would require 3 years of work to implement properly. She gave it to Nathan to read. He read it in one sitting. "It's good," he said. "It needs money it doesn't have yet," she said. "We'll get it, we?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said.
We.
She looked at the document in his hands. 12 pages, neatly written, representing the next stage of something she had started at 17 without knowing she'd started it. Her father had built a homestead for 9 years, and it had been taken in an afternoon. She had spent 12 years learning from that loss. Now she was building something that no land agent with a fraudulent clause could touch, not land, not water, not anything with a deed attached. Understanding. The capacity to see what a document actually said before signing it. The one thing that would have saved her father, and that she was determined to put into the hands of every rancher and homesteader who would accept it. Outside, the first snow of the second winter was beginning. It came quietly, the way good snow comes, without announcement, without drama, settling into the landscape and filling in the rough places. The ranch was ready for it. The cattle were in. The hay was stored. The bunkhouse was warm. The household was stocked. And the woman at the table and the man reading her document had between them enough of what actually mattered to last through whatever came next. The ranch that had been empty was full. The woman who had been underestimated had built something that would outlast the underestimating. The man who had confused size with strength had found out what strength actually was, not through a single moment, but through the accumulated evidence of watching someone carry 12 years of pain into something that protected others. That was the legacy. Not dramatic, not the stuff of the stories people told about frontier heroes. Just two people who saw each other clearly and chose to build something real with what they knew, and found that what they knew, put together, was more than enough.